She had built an empire from nothing, but she couldn't protect the one thing that mattered most. When 10-year-old Hailey Monroe stood before 300 of New York's most powerful people and asked, "Mom, when will I finally have a dad who stays?" The whole room stopped breathing. Vanessa Langford, one of the most feared CEOs in America, felt the question carved through every wall she'd spent 7 years building. And somewhere in the basement of her own headquarters, a man pushing a mop heard the same question echo through a security speaker and said nothing, because men like him had learned long ago that silence was the only armor that kept them alive. What happened next would destroy everything they both thought they knew about strength, safety, and what it actually takes to build a family from the wreckage of broken lives. If this kind of story moves something in you, subscribe to the channel right now because we tell these stories every week and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that like button and drop a comment below with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one runs deep. The ballroom at the Meridian Grand had seen a lot of things over the years. Hostile corporate takeovers disguised as cocktail receptions, marriages that were really mergers, smiles that cost more than most people earned in a year. But in 11 years of hosting New York's most elite annual charity gala, it had never gone completely, suffocatingly silent the way it did on that particular Thursday evening in October. When a 10-year-old girl in a pale blue dress walked up to the microphone her mother had just stepped away from and said 7 words that no amount of money could have prepared anyone for. "Mom, when will I finally have a dad who stays?" The question hung in the air above 300 people who suddenly had nowhere to look. Servers froze mid-step. A champagne glass stopped halfway to someone's lips. The string quartet in the corner wound down without instruction, the last note dissolving into the kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something real crashes through a room that has been carefully engineered to keep reality at a very comfortable distance. Vanessa Langford stood 4 steps from the podium, holding the edge of a draped table for exactly 2 seconds before she released it. 2 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Then she crossed the stage, crouched in front of her daughter so their eyes were level, and said, quietly enough that most of the room couldn't hear, "Baby, where did that come from?" Hailey looked back at her with the particular brand of honesty that only exists in children who haven't yet learned to perform. "You said tonight was about finding someone. I just wanted to know if it was really going to work this time." Vanessa's throat closed around whatever she'd been planning to say. She straightened up slowly, turned to face the room, and for the first time in 7 years of quarterly earnings calls, congressional testimonials, and boardroom confrontations with men twice her age, who had never believed she belonged there, Vanessa Langford had absolutely nothing prepared. What she said instead was this: "My daughter just asked me the most important question anyone has asked me in this building, and I don't have a rehearsed answer." She paused. "I have a promise. Over the next month, Hailey and I are going to meet people, not through business channels, not through curated introductions, not because someone's portfolio impressed my assistant, through ordinary life, the way regular people do it." She looked down at Hailey. "And we're going to figure it out together." The applause started slowly, then built. But Vanessa wasn't listening to it. She was watching her daughter's face, searching for something. Reassurance, maybe, that the promise hadn't sounded hollow, that it had landed the way she'd meant it. Hailey gave her a small, uncertain nod. It was not the reaction of a child who had been convinced. It was the reaction of a child who was willing to wait and see. Downstairs, on the 3rd sublevel of the Meridian Grand, in a service corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, a man named Logan Kane stood with a mop handle and listened to the same moment through a crackle of ceiling-mounted PA speakers that were technically supposed to broadcast fire safety announcements and nothing else. He didn't say anything when it ended. He wrung out the mop, pushed the bucket around the corner, and got back to work. Logan was 37 years old and had been working for Metropolitan Commercial Cleaning Services for 14 months. He was good at the job in the specific way that people are good at things they do not care about, efficiently, quietly, without complaint. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who smelled permanently of cigarettes and kept a family photo on his desk that was 4 years out of date, had written in Logan's last evaluation, "Reliable, independent, doesn't socialize much but never causes problems," which was accurate as far as it went. What Gerald didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that 18 months before taking the cleaning job, Logan Kane had been Major Logan Kane, United States Navy, assigned to a special operations unit whose official designation appeared in fewer than 40 documents in the entire federal government, most of them classified at levels that required clearances. Gerald couldn't have spelled correctly. Logan had run 26 classified operations across 4 continents. He had done things in service of his country that he would carry in his body for the rest of his life. Not in the way people talked about trauma in magazine articles, but in the specific mechanical way of a man who had made decisions under impossible conditions and knew that some of them would never fully resolve. He had been good at the work. He had been, by the measured assessment of people paid to evaluate such things, exceptional at the work. And then, during a mission in a country he was not officially in, a defense contractor named Harlan Briggs had made a decision that cost 3 civilian lives and needed someone to absorb the blame. Logan had been the one in the room. Logan had been the one without political protection. And Logan, rather than expose classified infrastructure that would have endangered a dozen ongoing operations and the people running them, had accepted a quiet administrative end to his career and walked away. He had a son to raise. Marcus was 8 years old and had spent more of his life waiting for his father to come home from somewhere unspecified than he had spent actually with him. Logan's ex-wife, Carla, had remarried 2 years earlier and moved to Portland. Marcus lived with Logan now, had for the past year, in a 2-bedroom apartment in Woodside, Queens that cost $1,100 a month and had a radiator that made sounds like someone was trapped inside it. Marcus was currently with their neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, who charged $20 an evening and always sent him home with a container of leftover jollof rice. Logan finished the corridor, checked his phone, a text from Mrs. Okafor saying Marcus had gone to bed without a fight, which was either a good sign or meant the kid was getting sick, and pushed the cart toward the service elevator. He rode it up to the lobby level, stepped off, and began working his way along the polished marble expanse of Langford Global's main headquarters, 2 blocks from the Meridian Grand. The gala had been held at the hotel, but half the building's executive staff had streamed back here afterward for drinks in the penthouse lounge, which meant the lobby was cycling through a steady traffic of expensively dressed people who tracked in rain and left rings from champagne glasses on surfaces that Logan would circle back to clean. I was on his second pass around a column base when he heard them talking. 2 men in dark suits standing near the building directory, voices low, but not low enough. She's going to do it publicly. Walk around the city with the kid, let people pitch themselves to her like it's some kind of open casting call. That's a liability disaster. Her security team is going to... Whitmore says she overruled security already. The whole thing is her show. What's Garrison planning to do? A pause. Same thing everyone else is planning to do. Get in front of her before the month's up. Logan didn't look at them. He moved the cart around the column and continued toward the far corridor. He had a policy about conversations he wasn't part of. They weren't part of him. He had learned, through years of operating in environments where information was currency and the wrong piece of it could get people killed, that the most dangerous thing a man could do was to start caring about things that weren't his assignment. His assignment right now was the marble floor. The marble floor needed his attention. He worked until 1:15 in the morning, clocked out in the service office, changed out of his uniform in the small locker room shared by 6 cleaning staff members, and took the N train back to Woodside in a car that held 4 other people, none of whom acknowledged each other's existence. Which was fine. Logan was comfortable with that particular social contract. He let himself into the apartment, checked Marcus's room. The boy was asleep on his stomach, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, which was apparently his preferred configuration, and went to the kitchen to eat the leftover rice Mrs. Okafor had sent back with him. He stood at the counter and ate it cold, and didn't turn on the television, because the television in the evenings had a way of making the apartment feel louder than the silence it replaced. 3 weeks after the gala, Vanessa Langford had met 11 men. She hadn't set out to meet 11. She'd set out to be open, to let things happen organically, the way she'd promised Hailey, the way she'd told 300 people and subsequently several million more, because the clip of her crouching on that stage had circulated through social media with the kind of velocity that made her communications director physically pale. The 11 men had materialized through the mechanics of her actual life. 2 had been introduced at a school fundraiser Hailey attended. 1 had approached her in the lobby of her building with what he described as not an agenda, but which was clearly a pitch deck in human form. 3 more had been connected through people she considered friends, which made her reassess what she meant by that word. The remaining 5 had found increasingly creative ways to enter her orbit through business channels that technically qualified as ordinary life only if you defined ordinary very loosely. They were all, in various ways, impressive. Intelligent men. Men with track records and reputations, and the particular ease of people who had never had to fight to be taken seriously in a room. One had run a logistics company that operated across 19 countries. Another sat on the boards of 4 nonprofits and spoke with genuine passion about education reform. A third had the kind of face that made you want to trust him immediately, which Vanessa recognized, after enough years in corporate environments, as its own kind of warning sign. Every conversation had felt, in some essential way she couldn't fully articulate, like a negotiation. Not because the men were being dishonest. She didn't think most of them were, but there was always something being managed, an image being maintained, a version of themselves that had been prepared for exactly this kind of encounter. They were performing readiness. And Vanessa, who had spent 7 years performing her own form of readiness, recognized it with a clarity that made her tired in a way she couldn't explain to anyone, because the explanation would have made her sound ungrateful for problems that most people would have been grateful to have. She mentioned it to her friend Diane over coffee one evening. Diane, who had known her since before Langford Global existed, back when Vanessa had been 22 years old and working double shifts to keep the lights on in a studio apartment she shared with a roommate who owned 3 cats and a philosophy degree. They all want something, Vanessa said. Not bitterly, just as an observation. Everyone wants something, Diane said. The question is whether what they want lines up with what you need. None of them have asked about Hailey. Not really. They ask about her the way you ask about someone's weekend, as a social gesture. Diane watched her over the rim of her cup. What does Hailey think? Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She was polite to all of them, which, with Hailey, is not actually a compliment. The incident at the Harwick Tower construction site happened on a Wednesday morning in early November. Vanessa had 3 developments currently in progress across the city, and she had a habit, which her security director, a former police commander named Patricia Roach, considered a professional liability, of doing unscheduled site visits. She liked to see things in process. She'd grown up watching her father rewire electrical panels in other people's houses, and something in her was always drawn to the intermediate state of things. The scaffolding, the exposed framing, the moment before a thing became what it was going to be. She brought Hailey that morning because the school had a teacher training day, and Hailey had asked, with careful casualness, whether she could come along. Vanessa's security detail consisted of 2 men. Roach had assigned 4, but 2 had called in the same morning, which in retrospect was not a coincidence. The team running cleanup and prep at Harwick Tower was contracted through a company called Delmar Services. The workers in Delmar uniforms who had been on site since 6 a.m. were, for the most part, not Delmar employees. Logan was there because Metropolitan Commercial had a subcontract for the site, and he'd been assigned the morning shift with a colleague named Ferris, a 53-year-old man who had strong opinions about sandwiches and not much else. Logan was on the 7th floor when the first of Vanessa's security team came through on the radio with a clipped professional alert that cut off mid-sentence. He moved to the window and looked down. 4 vehicles were blocking the site entrance. Men were moving in organized patterns across the ground level. One of Vanessa's security guards was face down on the concrete with someone standing over him. Logan stood at the window for about 4 seconds. Then he set down his radio, stepped back from the window, and started moving. Ferris looked up from the corner where he'd been eating an early lunch. "Where are you?" "Stay exactly here," Logan said. "Don't use your phone. Don't go near the windows. Don't make noise. I'll be back." "What is happening?" "Ferris!" Logan's voice had shifted into something that made the older man go completely still. "Stay here." He moved into the stairwell. The construction site had 8 floors of completed framing and 3 more in progress. Logan had been on this job for 11 days and had done what he always did in any new space, mapped it. Not consciously. Not the way someone with a plan maps things, but the way a person does when stillness is not something they've ever fully trusted, when some part of them never fully stops calculating exit routes and structural advantages and the places where sound carries and the places where it doesn't. He came down the east stairwell to the fourth floor and found three construction workers huddled in a utility alcove, one of them bleeding from a cut on his forearm. They looked up at him with the specific expression of people who were waiting to be told what to do. East stairwell goes to the basement, Logan said. There's a service exit behind the electrical panel room. Do you know it? One of the workers, a young guy, maybe 22, with a hard hat pushed back on his head, nodded. Take these two. Go now. Don't stop. What about go? They went. He found Vanessa on the fifth floor, which had not yet been fully walled in on the south side, the open framework giving a view of the street that would have been spectacular under different circumstances. She was backed against a concrete pillar with Hailey pressed behind her, and one of her security men, the one who hadn't been taken at the entrance, standing in front of them with his weapon drawn and his hands shaking just enough that Logan clocked it from 15 feet away. Two men in Delmar uniforms were moving toward them from the far end of the floor. One had a radio, the other had a weapon. Vanessa's guard fired once, missed badly, and the return movement from the two men was fast and coordinated in a way that was immediately clarifying about what kind of training they'd had. Logan came in from the service corridor on their flank. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not something he would have been able to fully narrate afterward, not because it was a blur, but because the individual components of it were so compressed and sequential that they didn't parse as separate events. He moved into the space between the two men before either of them had processed his presence. The first man went down hard, fast, in a way that produced no prolonged struggle. The second turned and raised his weapon, and Logan was already inside the arc of it, close enough that the weapon became a liability rather than an advantage. And the struggle lasted less than 3 seconds before it was over. He disarmed the second man, zip-tied both with the plastic restraints he'd picked up from a tool supply shelf on the third floor because old habits were very hard to break, and turned around. Vanessa Langford was staring at him, not with relief exactly, though that was there, but with something else, something that was working through several layers of processing simultaneously, because what she had just watched did not correspond to any category her brain had prepared for the man who mopped floors in her headquarters building. Hailey had her face pressed against her mother's jacket. Vanessa's hand was in her daughter's hair. Logan looked at the security guard, who had lowered his weapon and appeared to be running a very hasty internal review of his career. There are at least 4 more on the ground level, Logan said. 2 on the second floor. You need to get them out now, before the group on the ground reconverges. How do you... The guard stopped, started again. Who are you? I work here, Logan said. East stairwell. Go, Masa. They made it out through the basement service exit, the same route Logan had sent the construction workers. By the time the police arrived, most of the men in Delmar uniforms had scattered, but 3 had been efficiently immobilized on various floors by a man nobody seemed to have gotten a clear look at. Hailey, sitting in the back of a police vehicle wrapped in a reflective blanket, had not cried once. She looked shaken and very young and very controlled, in the particular way of a child who has watched her parent practice that same control and has, without meaning to, learned it. Vanessa sat beside her with one arm around her shoulders, answering questions from a detective in a monotone that indicated she was running on the far edge of her reserves. But every few minutes, her eyes moved to the perimeter of the scene. Searching. He wasn't there anymore. By the time the police had finished with the immediate scene, someone from Metropolitan Commercial had confirmed that, yes, one of their employees had been on site that morning. A man named Logan Kane, 7-floor assignment, clocked in at 7, no criminal record, good work history, nothing else on file. Vanessa looked at the name for a long time. Hailey was asleep against her shoulder when the car finally took them home, and Vanessa sat with the sound of the city moving past the windows and thought about a man who had walked into a room with armed people in it, handled what he found there with the efficiency of someone for whom this was not a new category of experience, and then apparently gone back to work. She thought about the way he'd moved, the way he'd spoken to her guard, not with authority performing itself, not with the kind of tactical language that men used when they wanted to sound impressive, just clean, direct, absolutely certain. She thought about how he hadn't looked at her the way every person in that building usually looked at her, and she thought, for no reason she could have immediately explained, about what Hailey had asked that Thursday evening 3 weeks ago, standing at a microphone in a ballroom full of people who had everything except the particular thing that actually mattered. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to her assistant. I need everything we have on an employee named Logan Kane. He's contracted through Metropolitan Commercial. Not a background check. Everything. She put the phone away, looked out the window. The city was gray and wet and entirely itself, indifferent to the fact that something had shifted, or was shifting, or was about to. Outside, somewhere in the rain, a man took the N train back to Queens and sat in a car with strangers who did not acknowledge him, and was profoundly grateful for that. The file Patricia Roach dropped on Vanessa's desk the following morning was thinner than expected. That was the first thing Vanessa noticed. For a man who had apparently walked through an active hostage situation and neutralized armed professionals with his bare hands, Logan Kane left almost no footprint in the world that a standard background search could find. Patricia sat across from her with the particular expression she wore when she was about to say something her employer wasn't going to like. Roach was 51, built like someone who had spent decades not making excuses, and had the kind of face that communicated information even when her mouth was closed. Clean record, Patricia said. No priors, no civil suits, no financial flags. Pays his taxes. His son is enrolled at PS 153 in Woodside. He has a lease on an apartment, a bank account, with a balance that tells you he's careful with money, but not comfortable. His employment history before Metropolitan Commercials, she paused. Sparse. Sparse how? Sparse as in there's a 7-year window that has exactly 2 entries. One is a security consulting firm in Virginia that dissolved in 2019. Before that, military service. Another pause. The discharge papers say honorable, but the classification on his service record is at a level I don't have authorization to access. Vanessa looked at the file without touching it. Who does? I've made some calls. I'm waiting to hear back. Patricia leaned forward slightly. Vanessa, what this man did yesterday was not a civilian skill set. I've seen trained close protection professionals with years of experience panic under less pressure than he was under. He didn't panic. I know. He also didn't stay. He didn't give a statement to police. He was listed as a witness and cleared the scene before the detective got to him. The officer who took his name described him as cooperative, but Patricia checked her notes. Quote, seemed like he wanted to be anywhere else. I know, Vanessa said again. She picked up the file then and opened it. Logan Kane's employment photo from Metropolitan Commercial stared back at her. The kind of photograph that was taken by someone pointing a phone at a person who was not trying to look like anything at all. He looked directly at the camera with eyes that were not unfriendly, not guarded exactly, just present, waiting for the thing to be over so he could move on to whatever came next. She had seen that expression somewhere before. Then she placed it. She saw it in her own mirror on mornings when she was running on 4 hours of sleep and had 3 back-to-back meetings before 9 a.m. and had already told herself that she was fine, that everything was manageable, that she didn't need anyone to ask how she was doing because she already knew the answer and the answer wasn't useful to dwell on. She closed the file. I want to talk to him, she said. Patricia's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite concern but was adjacent to it. That's your call. But if I'm advising you professionally, he came through yesterday, yes, and we don't fully know who he is yet. No, Vanessa said. We don't. She looked out the window at the mid-morning city, gray and operational, everyone going somewhere with purpose, or the appearance of it. Set it up, she said. Well, Metropolitan Commercial's dispatcher, a woman named Rita, who had clearly fielded stranger requests in her career but was trying not to show it, confirmed that Logan Kane was scheduled for the Langford Global Headquarters building that same evening, standard Thursday night rotation, floors 2 through 6. She seemed unsure whether to be pleased or nervous that the CEO of the building knew this. Vanessa waited until 9 p.m. when most of the executive floor had emptied out, before she took the elevator down to the second level and found him in the east corridor near the copy room, running a buffer over a stretch of floor that was already, by any reasonable standard, clean enough. He had earbuds in, one of them, the right one, the left ear apparently kept clear by habit, and he didn't hear her until she was close enough that pretending he hadn't would have been its own statement. He pulled the earbud out and turned around and looked at her with an expression that was not surprised exactly, but was doing a careful, visible job of staying level. Ms. Langford, can you stop for a minute? He reached down and turned off the machine. The hallway went quiet. He straightened up and waited, which was something she noticed. He didn't fill the silence. Most people filled the silence. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you did yesterday." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I wanted to." She watched him. "Are you all right? You weren't there when the detective came around." "I gave my name. They had what they needed." "They had your name. They didn't have what happened on the 5th floor." Something moved across his face. Not discomfort, more like the recognition that a door he'd been standing in front of had just been opened from the other side. "I helped some people get out of a building. That's the part that matters." The two men they found zip-tied to a support column, Vanessa said, were both former military. One of them had an Interpol flag. "The detective told me this morning." She paused. "That's not something a cleaning contractor does, Logan." The use of his first name landed in the air between them. He didn't correct it. "My daughter was in that building," she said. And then, because she hadn't planned to say the next part, but it came out anyway, she hasn't had someone step in front of something for her in a very long time. Neither have I. So I needed to say thank you in person, not through an HR form. He looked at her for a moment with those same level eyes from the employment photograph, and then something in them shifted, not softened exactly, but relented slightly, the way a door does when the latch releases. "How is she?" he said. "Your daughter." Quieter than usual, which for Hailey means she's processing something. Vanessa crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was holding herself in a shape that felt manageable. "She asked me last night whether the man who helped us was okay. I didn't know what to tell her." "Tell her I'm fine." "Are you?" He didn't answer immediately, and she appreciated that he didn't manufacture one. "I'm fine," he said, and it had the texture of something that was mostly true but not entirely uncomplicated. She nodded once. "Okay." She started to turn, then stopped. "For what it's worth, whatever you were before this job, whatever happened, you didn't hesitate yesterday. Not for a second. That's not nothing." He didn't say anything to that. She didn't wait for him to. She went back to the elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor and stood looking at her own reflection in the brushed steel doors while they slid shut. Behind her, in the empty corridor, Logan Kane stood very still for a moment. Then he put the earbud back in and turned the machine back on. Well, Marcus asked about the news story 3 days later. Logan had managed to keep it off the television and his phone put away. But Marcus was 8 and had friends at school, and the friends had parents who talked. And a kidnapping attempt involving a famous billionaire CEO at a construction site was exactly the kind of story that traveled through a 3rd-grade classroom at speed. "Dad." Marcus was eating cereal at the kitchen table, feet swinging because he was still just short enough that they didn't reach the floor. "Were you at that building? The one on the news?" Logan poured his own coffee. "What building?" "The Harwick one. They said a janitor saved that lady. Was that you?" "I work at a lot of buildings." Marcus gave him the look, the one that had been developing over the past year into something remarkably similar to the look Logan's own mother had deployed when he was a teenager attempting evasion. "Dad, I helped some people get out of a situation. It wasn't a big deal." "The news said it was a big deal." "The news has to make things sound like big deals. That's what the news is for." Marcus seemed to consider this with the genuine philosophical interest of a child who was still sorting out how much of what adults said was true versus how much was just what adults said. He took another spoonful of cereal. "Were you scared?" Logan sat down across from him. This was the kind of question that had a right answer and an easy answer, and he'd made himself a rule, after Carla left, that he was going to try to give Marcus the right one even when it was harder to say. "For a second," he said, "before I figured out what needed to happen." Marcus chewed on that, literally and figuratively. "But then you weren't scared anymore?" "Then I was busy." Scared and busy are hard to do at the same time. The boy seemed to find this satisfying in a way that longer explanations might not have been. He went back to his cereal. Logan drank his coffee and looked at the kitchen wall where Marcus had taped up a drawing he'd made at school. A house with a lopsided chimney and 2 figures standing in front of it, one tall and one short, labeled in the careful lettering of a kid still learning to make his letters go the right direction. Dad and me. There was no third figure. Logan noticed that every time he looked at it and said nothing and kept noticing. What? The media, meanwhile, had taken the story and done with it what media reliably does. Made it bigger, flatter, and stranger than the original. Billionaire CEO rescued by mystery janitor had the viral geometry of a story that practically moved itself. Class inversion, physical heroism, the visual contrast of a cleaning uniform against the backdrop of an attempted kidnapping. By the fourth day, the clip of Vanessa at the gala, her daughter's question, her spontaneous promise, was being stitched together with breathless speculation about whether the mystery janitor was her answer. Vanessa's communications director, a precise, perpetually underslept man named Arthur Fenn, came to her office that morning with the look of someone who had been managing a crisis since approximately 4 a.m. and was running on the wrong side of his second wind. "The narrative is writing itself," he said, "and not in a way we control." "I know." They're calling him the hero janitor. 3 networks have used that phrase. TMZ has a blurry security camera photo they're describing as potentially the man responsible. 17 influencers have already made videos. Arthur. His name hasn't leaked yet, but it will. These things always... Arthur. She waited until he stopped moving. Whatever happens with the coverage, we're not going to issue a statement that mentions him by name. If his name comes out, it doesn't come from us. Is that clear? Fenn blinked. Clear, yes. He looked at his tablet, then back at her. For what it's worth, the sympathy metrics on your approval numbers are the best they've been since the company's Series C announcement. People like the story. People like the story because a man did something decent, and my daughter is safe. It's not a metrics event, Arthur. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. Right, of course. He retreated toward the door. I'll handle the inquiries. When he was gone, Vanessa turned back to the window. 11 floors below, the city moved with its usual indifference. Pedestrians, taxis, a delivery truck double-parked on the corner while the driver hauled boxes with the resigned efficiency of a man who had given up expecting anyone to make room. She thought about Logan in the corridor 2 nights ago, the way he'd stood there with his hands relaxed at his sides, not performing anything, not managing his image, just answering her questions with the minimum number of words that honesty required. She picked up her phone and called Patricia Roach. Where are we on the service record? Patricia's answer came without preamble, because she was that kind of person. I heard back from my contact at the DoD this morning. The classification on Kane's file is legitimate and current, which means it's not just old paperwork that nobody got around to updating. Someone is actively maintaining that classification. A pause. That doesn't happen unless there's an operational reason. What kind of operational reason? The kind where the people involved are either still active or the information about what they did is still sensitive enough that exposure would cause problems. My contact wouldn't say more than that. Another pause, shorter. He did say one other thing. He said, and I'm quoting, "Whoever that man is, he would have had to give up a great deal to end up where he is." Vanessa sat with that for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Thank you, Patricia." She set the phone down and looked at the thin file still on the corner of her desk. The employment photo, the sparse work history, the 7-year gap that wasn't a gap at all, but was something her security director couldn't access and a DoD contact wouldn't explain. A man who could have used what he knew to protect himself, and hadn't. She understood that particular choice in a way she couldn't have explained to most people. When her husband Daniel had died, a cardiac event at 41, no warning, no negotiation, no time to prepare anything, just absence where a person had been, she had understood for the first time what it meant to choose silence over the easier path of being seen in your grief. She had chosen silence. She had gone back to work within a week, which her therapist at the time had described as a coping strategy with significant long-term costs, and which Vanessa had understood was true and chosen anyway, because the alternative was falling apart in a way that felt like it might not stop. She had never stopped paying those long-term costs. She was fairly certain Logan Kane hadn't either. So, the suitors, as Vanessa had privately started thinking of them, a word she used ironically because it made the situation feel slightly less absurd, continued to surface through the month. The media attention had, if anything, accelerated their interest. Being seen with Vanessa Langford had always carried a certain social and professional weight, but now there was an added dimension. Whoever she chose would be positioned against the romantic backdrop of the hero janitor story, which meant they needed to project qualities that could survive that comparison. Several of them were trying very hard. A man named Garrison Cole, 43, self-described entrepreneur. The kind of person who said entrepreneur the way other people said physician, had inserted himself into her professional orbit 3 weeks before the Harwick incident through a mutual acquaintance and had since escalated his efforts with the dogged persistence of someone who had decided that this was a problem solvable by application of sufficient resources. Garrison was handsome in the way of men who had decided at some point that their appearance was an asset to be maintained and had pursued that maintenance with professional discipline. He wore his suits like they were armor, which Vanessa recognized because she wore her own suits the same way, though she was at least aware she was doing it. He had sent flowers to her office twice. Not extravagant arrangements, he was too calibrated for that, but precise, tasteful, the kind of bouquet that announced I did research rather than I felt something. He had also, through channels she hadn't yet fully traced, obtained information about a charity initiative she was quietly developing, a fund for children from low-income families to access performing arts programs, and had made a donation substantial enough to require acknowledgement. She acknowledged it. She did not, as he had clearly hoped, use the acknowledgement as an entry point for a longer conversation. What she didn't know, sitting in her office on a cold Thursday morning reviewing quarterly projections, was that Garrison Cole was also, through a separately maintained set of relationships that he kept carefully walled off from his public profile, in contact with the people who had sent armed men to Harwick Tower. Not as a conspirator, exactly. The arrangement was more complex than that and more deniable. He had not ordered the kidnapping. What he had done, through an intermediary whose name appeared nowhere in anything he signed, was pass along information about Vanessa's schedule, her habit of doing unannounced site visits, the specific timing of the Harwick inspection, to people who had their own reasons for wanting leverage over the CEO of Langford Global. What happened with that information was, in Garrison's framing of events to himself, not his responsibility. He was very good at framing things to himself. What he had not anticipated was Logan Kane. The failed operation at Harwick had cost his contacts significant resources and produced no usable result, and the man who had dismantled it was now, according to the coverage Garrison consumed with obsessive attention over the following days, being romantically associated with the woman Garrison had decided was going to matter to his next phase of ambitions. This was a problem with several dimensions, the most immediate of which was that Logan Kane, if anyone looked at him closely enough, would eventually lead people back toward the information leak that had made Harwick possible. Garrison was not a man who tolerated loose threads. He had a conversation, through the intermediary, about options. Logan found out he was being investigated on a Tuesday morning, not from any official source, but from Gerald, his supervisor, who had the expression of a man delivering news he found confusing and slightly beyond his pay grade. Someone from corporate came in yesterday, Gerald said. They were in the service office at Langford Global, Gerald behind his desk, Logan standing because the second chair had a box of cleaning supplies on it that nobody had moved in approximately 3 months. HR level. They said they were doing a routine check on contracted staff credentials. I gave them your file. That's fine. They asked specific questions, Logan, about your work history, your references. They wanted to know if you'd ever accessed restricted areas of the building. Logan was quiet for a moment. Had I? Not according to any records I have. Gerald shifted his weight. I want to be straight with you. These didn't feel like routine questions. No, Logan agreed. They probably weren't. He drove Marcus to school that morning with the particular focused quiet of a man running calculations. He walked Marcus to the door, something he didn't always do, and which Marcus noticed without commenting on, though he did look back once with an expression that was too knowing for 8, and then sat in the car in the school drop-off lane until a van behind him honked and he pulled forward. He called his sister in the evening once Marcus was in bed. Dana, who was 41 and lived in Raleigh with her husband and 2 teenagers and a dog that had the same energy as a malfunctioning piece of equipment, answered on the second ring with the immediate alertness of a person who knew that her brother only called when something had weight to it. What's happening? She said, not as a question. Someone is looking into my background at work. Logan, I don't know who yet. It might be standard procedure given what happened at the construction site. He paused. It might not be. The line was quiet for a moment. When Dana spoke again, her voice was careful in the way of someone managing their own reaction for the sake of the conversation. Are you safe? Is Marcus? Marcus is fine. I'm fine. He sat at the kitchen table, the city running its nighttime inventory of sounds outside the window. A bus, someone's music from an upper floor, the radiator starting its routine. I just wanted someone to know. What are you going to do? I'm going to go to work tomorrow, and the day after. He looked at the drawing on the wall. Dad and me. I don't have a lot of other options right now, Dana said quietly. You always have options. You just hate every choice that requires asking for help. He didn't argue with that because it was accurate. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Her daughter's volleyball tournament, a neighbor's construction project that had been ongoing since spring, and then said goodbye with the particular warmth of siblings who don't require explanation from each other and are, both of them, relieved by that. Logan sat at the table after the call ended. He thought about Vanessa Langford in the corridor, the way she'd looked at him without performing anything, without the management that everyone around her seemed to perform constantly. He thought about what she'd said. Whatever you were before this job, whatever happened, you didn't hesitate. He thought about Marcus asleep in the next room. He thought about Harwick and the two men he'd put down, and the look on the youngest construction worker's face when Logan had pointed him toward the service exit. Pure animal relief, the specific gratitude of someone who has been told exactly what to do in a moment when the alternatives were too frightening to process. He had spent 14 months trying to be a person who didn't know how to do what he knew how to do. Standing up from the table, he put his coffee cup in the sink and went to check the door lock. Not from paranoia, just habit, and looked out through the peephole into the hallway, which was empty and lit with the yellowed fluorescence of a landlord who replaced bulbs reluctantly. He stood there for a moment, hand still on the door. Then he went to bed. The credential investigation turned into something else 3 weeks later, when Logan arrived at Langford Global for the evening shift, and Gerald was waiting for him in the service office with a different expression than usual, not confused this time, but tight-mouthed and uncomfortable in a way that meant the news was worse. I need you to come in and sit down, Gerald said. Logan sat. Corporate security came back this morning. They're saying there was unauthorized access to the third-floor server room 2 weeks ago, Tuesday. They pulled the card logs. Gerald placed a printed sheet on the desk between them. Your access card shows entry at 11:47 p.m. Logan looked at the sheet. I wasn't in that building 2 weeks ago, Tuesday. I was assigned to the Midtown property on Tuesdays. I know that. I've got your timesheet. Then there's a mistake in their log. Gerald's expression said that he knew that, and that knowing it wasn't going to be enough. They want to put you on administrative suspension while they investigate. I pushed back. I told them you've got a clean record, and this doesn't match anything I know about you. But Logan. He spread his hands in the specific gesture of a man who has tried and reached the end of his capacity to try. It's above my level. Corporate security made the call. Logan sat with that for a moment. He thought about the access card, standard issue, kept on his lanyard, same as every other contracted employee. He thought about a 3-week-old investigation with oddly specific questions. He thought about the timeline and about the fact that someone had needed a reason to put him out of this building before they needed to do something else in it. Okay, he said. Gerald blinked. Okay? I'll collect my things. Logan stood. I didn't access that server room. You know that and I know that. But okay. Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man watching something slightly wrong happen and being unable to articulate why it felt worse than it should. Logan, if you want to fight this, I'll be in touch, Logan said. He cleaned out his locker, which didn't take long because he didn't keep much in it. A change of shirt, a phone charger, a paperback Marcus had left in his bag 3 weeks ago and that he'd been meaning to return. He put everything in his duffel and walked out through the service exit into the November evening, the cold hitting him immediately, the city going about its business in the particular aggressive way of New York on a weekday night. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The street was lit amber under the lamps, pedestrians moving in the practiced choreography of people who had learned to navigate shared space without looking at each other. A cab came around the corner too fast, headlights sweeping. Across the street, In the lobby, visible through the glass, he could see part of the executive floor elevator bank. He didn't know if Vanessa was still in the building. He didn't let himself think about whether she was. He turned up his collar and started walking toward the subway. 2 blocks later, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stopped walking and looked at it for a long moment before he answered. Kane. A voice he didn't recognize, clipped, administrative, the voice of someone who delivered information for a living. Speaking. You've been flagged for suspension from your contracted position at Langford Global. You should know, the access log showing your card was not produced by your card. Logan was very still. Around him, the city moved without him. Who is this? Someone who's been watching the same thread you're about to pull. A pause. Don't go back to that building tonight, and keep your son close. The line went dead. Logan stood on the sidewalk with the phone in his hand. The cold was very clear. His breath made shapes in it. He called Mrs. Okafor before he'd taken another 3 steps. She picked up on the first ring, sounding surprised, and he said, I'm going to come get Marcus early tonight, if that's okay. I'll explain later. She said, of course, and he said thank you, and he was already moving toward the subway before the call ended. Whatever was coming, he realized, was not going to give him the option of staying invisible. The 14 months of quiet he had built, carefully, painstakingly, like a man laying floor tile with borrowed tools, was about to be pulled from under him. And somewhere in the building he'd just walked away from, a man named Garrison Cole was making a phone call of his own, because loose threads had a way of finding their own ends if you didn't cut them first. Marcus didn't ask why his father had picked him up early. He asked once, in the elevator up to their floor, whether everything was okay, and Logan said yes, which was the kind of answer that contained just enough truth to be usable. Marcus seemed to file it away in the particular category of dad things I don't fully understand yet, and went to brush his teeth without being asked, which was either a sign of unusual maturity or evidence that he'd sensed something in the air and was responding to it the only way an 8-year-old knows how, by being very, very good. Logan sat at the kitchen table after Marcus was in bed and thought about the phone call. The voice had been male, American, middle-aged. No regional accent he could pin down precisely. The flat cadence of someone trained to communicate without revealing geography or emotion. What struck him most was not what had been said, but what the call's existence implied. That someone had been watching the situation at Langford Global closely enough to know about the suspension within hours of it happening, and had decided that warning Logan was worth the risk of making contact, which meant either they had interests that aligned with his, or they needed something from him that required him to stay functional. Neither possibility was entirely comforting. He went to the closet in his bedroom, the top shelf, behind a folded blanket Marcus had outgrown, but that Logan hadn't thrown away because Marcus had dragged it everywhere for 2 years, and some things you don't throw away, and pulled down a fireproof document box. Inside, Marcus's birth certificate, their lease, his own discharge papers, and a prepaid phone he'd bought with cash 14 months ago and never once used. He held it for a moment. Then he put it back, replaced the blanket, and closed the closet. Not yet. Whatever was coming, he needed more information before he started making moves that couldn't be unmade. He went to bed at midnight and stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the radiator make its nightly argument with itself, until eventually his body did what bodies trained for deprivation learned to do. It took sleep when sleep was available, regardless of what the mind was doing. Vanessa found out about Logan's suspension the following morning, not from Patricia, not from HR, but from Arthur Fenn, who had a gift for acquiring information from lateral sources, and had picked it up through the facility's management chain in the form of a routine staffing change notice that had, for reasons he couldn't explain, triggered his instinct that something was not routine about it. He put it on her desk alongside her calendar summary and her coffee without comment, which was its own form of comment. She read it twice. Then she called Patricia. I know, Patricia said before Vanessa had finished framing the question. I'm already looking at it. The access log is wrong, Vanessa. I pulled the raw data from the server room system myself. The card read registered, yes, but the biometric secondary confirmation that the system requires for that particular room did not trigger, which means either the system glitched or someone cloned his card number and used it in a way that the biometric step couldn't validate because the physical card wasn't present. Someone set him up. That's what the evidence suggests, yes. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Through her office windows, the city had the particular hard brightness of a November morning when the sun actually shows up. Light that doesn't warm anything but illuminates everything mercilessly. Who benefits from him being out of this building? That's the question I've been sitting with since 6 this morning. Patricia's voice had an edge to it that Vanessa recognized. It was the edge of a person who was angry and was disciplining the anger into something useful. The access attempt on the server room happened the night of November 14th. Do you want to know who was in this building that evening on a late meeting? Vanessa waited. Garrison Cole. He had a 7 o'clock with your CFO about a potential co-investment structure. Building records show he didn't badge out until 11:22 p.m. The silence between them had weight to it. That puts him in the building, Vanessa said carefully, 25 minutes before the access log shows Logan's card. Yes, it does. Patricia, is this? I don't know yet. I'm not going to tell you it's confirmed because it isn't, but I'm going to find out. A pause. There's something else. I got more back on Kane this morning, from a different contact, someone who was at DOD but retired 6 years ago and has fewer constraints about what he'll say. Vanessa straightened slightly. Tell me. Logan Kane was a major assigned to a classified maritime interdiction unit operating under joint authority between Naval Special Warfare Command and a contracted intelligence arm. He ran 12 confirmed operations in 4 years, plus an additional 14 that exist only in documents I don't have clearance for. His record was, by every metric they used to evaluate these people, exceptional. Patricia stopped. Then, in the spring of 2021, his unit was deployed to interdict a weapons shipment in an unspecified location. The mission was compromised. 3 people died who shouldn't have died. A defense contractor named Harlan Briggs, who held the intelligence contract supporting the operation, provided targeting data that was incorrect. Deliberately incorrect, according to my source, though proving it required access Kane didn't have. He was blamed for it, Vanessa said. He was made available to be blamed for it, which is slightly different. A formal inquiry was initiated. Kane had evidence, partial evidence, enough to raise serious questions about Briggs, but presenting it would have required exposing the full operational architecture of his unit, including people still active in the field. A pause. He didn't present it. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. He took the loss. He negotiated a quiet administrative separation in exchange for the inquiry being closed. Harlan Briggs went on to receive 2 additional government contracts worth a combined $400 million. Patricia's tone was controlled, but only just. Kane moved to New York, got his son, and took a cleaning job. The line was quiet for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on Vanessa's windowsill, looked at her with one orange eye, and left. Where is he now? Vanessa asked. I have an address in Woodside. I need you to reach him, not officially. Don't call his work number. He doesn't have the job anymore. Try his personal cell. She paused. And Patricia, whatever he's willing to share, whatever he's not, we treat this carefully. He didn't ask for any of this. Understood. Another pause, shorter than the others. For the record, Vanessa, in 22 years of security work, I've seen a lot of people in situations where staying quiet cost them everything. Most of them were not quiet out of nobility. They were quiet because they were scared, or because they calculated that the quiet would eventually pay off. She stopped. I don't think that's why he did it. Vanessa didn't answer that because she didn't have an answer. Just the knowledge that Patricia was right, and that the knowledge was doing something to her that she hadn't been prepared for this morning when she sat down at her desk with a calendar summary and a coffee. She set the phone down and looked at the suspension notice again. Logan Kane, contract employee, Metropolitan Commercial Cleaning Services. Administrative suspension pending investigation of unauthorized access. She picked up the phone again and called her general counsel. Logan was at the laundromat on Woodside Avenue, the one that had 3 machines permanently out of service, and a television mounted in the corner playing a cable news channel that nobody was watching, when his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring once, twice, then answered because ignoring numbers he didn't recognize was a luxury he'd given up the previous evening. Mr. Kane, my name is Patricia Roach. I'm the Director of Security for Langford Global. A brief pause. I work for Vanessa Langford. I want you to know this call is coming from her, not from corporate HR, and it's not about the suspension. Logan watched a dryer rotating someone else's laundry. What's it about? We have reason to believe your access card was cloned and the log entry used to manufacture grounds for your removal from the building. I want to share what we've found and ask if you'd be willing to meet." He was quiet for a moment. Across the laundromat, a young mother was folding clothes with the focused efficiency of someone for whom time was extremely finite, a toddler sitting on a plastic chair beside her eating crackers from a zip bag. "Mr. Kane?" "I'm here." He shifted the phone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it appears someone went to significant effort to remove you specifically from that building, and we'd like to understand why before we file the incident report that will clear your record." She paused. "And because what happened at Harwick Tower, Ms. Langford wanted me to say this directly, is something she hasn't stopped thinking about. It was the last part that decided him, not because it flattered him. He didn't trust flattery and had learned to recognize it with the same reflex he used to recognize an unsecured room, but because of the specificity of it. Not what you did or how you helped us. What happened, as if it was a shared event rather than a transaction. Where and when, he said. They met the following afternoon at a coffee shop in Long Island City. Neutral ground, Roach's suggestion, a place with enough ambient noise that a conversation didn't carry, and enough foot traffic that two people sitting at a corner table looked like nothing at all. Logan arrived 8 minutes early, sat with his back to the wall, ordered a black coffee he didn't particularly want, and was reading the menu for the second time when Patricia Roach walked in. She was not what he'd expected, which told him that he'd been making assumptions, which was its own useful data point about where his head was. She was compact and direct in her movements, and looked at him across the room with the immediate assessment of someone cataloging information before the conversation started. Not aggressively, just efficiently. She sat down, ordered tea, and put a manila folder on the table without opening it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said there was evidence about the card." "There is." She opened the folder and turned 2 printed pages toward him. He looked at them. Raw system data, authentication logs, the biometric gap Patricia had described on the phone. He'd worked in environments where this kind of documentation was used to build operational cases, and he could read it the way a person reads their own handwriting. It was unambiguous. "Whoever used my card number," Logan said, "wasn't me." "No." The secondary verification didn't complete. The system should have rejected the access attempt, but there was a software patch applied to the server room authentication protocol 3 days before this incident that appears to have introduced a gap in the biometric requirement under certain timing conditions. She paused. That patch was requested by someone in the IT department whose access level shouldn't have allowed the request. "We're tracing it." "You have a name?" "We have a user account. The account belongs to a junior network administrator who says he was given the patch parameters by a senior consultant who was brought in for a system upgrade last month." She looked at him steadily. "The consulting firm that sent that senior consultant was contracted through a holding company that has a documented business relationship with Garrison Cole." Logan set down his coffee. He had never heard the name Garrison Cole before the previous week, and then he had heard it twice in 48 hours. Once in a message from Dana, who had been doing her own searching after their call, and had texted him a name attached to a question mark, and now here. "Tell me about Cole," he said. Patricia told him. She laid it out in the clean, sequential way of someone who had organized information for professional purposes. Cole's background, his insertion into Vanessa's orbit, the business interests that overlapped with Langford Global's development portfolio, the late evening in the building, the 25-minute gap. Then she put a second set of papers in front of him, a financial disclosure document with 3 lines highlighted in yellow. Logan looked at them. "Cole has a beneficial interest in a security company called Meridian Tactical Group," Patricia said. "It's structured through 2 layers of holding entities, which is why it didn't surface in standard disclosure checks. Meridian Tactical Group employs several individuals who have prior association with a private contracting firm that did work for..." She paused. "Harlan Briggs." The laundromat, the ceiling of his bedroom, the prepaid phone on the top shelf. All the small geometries of the past 14 months arranged themselves into a different pattern, and Logan sat with the new shape of it for a moment. "He's connected to Briggs," Logan said, not a question. "Indirectly, there are 2 degrees of separation business-wise, but one of the men Meridian Tactical employs was directly involved in the intelligence operation that..." Patricia stopped carefully. "That ended your military career." The coffee shop made its sounds around them. Milk being steamed somewhere behind the counter, the bell over the door as someone left. A child at a nearby table asking the same question twice because the first answer hadn't satisfied. Logan looked at the papers for a long time. He had known, in the abstract way that people know things they can't fully face yet, that what had happened to him in 2021 had not been random. Bureaucratic malice existed in every institution large enough to have competing interests, and he had been in the path of someone else's competing interests at the wrong moment. But knowing it abstractly and sitting across from documentation of the specific machinery of it were different things. "What does Cole want from Langford Global?" he said. "That we're still determining." But his interest in the company accelerated significantly after the Harwick incident. "Our theory," Patricia chose her words with visible care, "is that Harwick was not primarily a kidnapping for ransom. The organization behind it has a pattern of acquiring leverage over high-value targets, leverage they then use to extract business concessions, exclusive contracts, data access, development site approvals. Vanessa's company controls 3 development sites in the outer boroughs that sit on transit corridors being evaluated for major infrastructure expansion. The land value, with the right approvals, would be substantial. And Cole is connected to the organization that ran Harwick." "We believe so. Not directly. There are intermediaries. But the information about Vanessa's schedule that enabled the Harwick operation had to come from somewhere close enough to her professional calendar to be accurate. Cole had access to that calendar through his contact with her CFO. She looked at him levelly. "You dismantled an operation that would have given them significant leverage. That made you a problem." Logan was quiet. "So the suspension," he said, "getting me out of the building." "They're planning something else," Patricia said. "We don't know what or when, but removing you first suggests they're aware of what you're capable of." She paused, "which raises its own questions about how much they know about your background." He looked at her. "Briggs knows." "If Cole and Briggs are connected, then yes. Briggs would know enough to know that a man with your training in that building was a liability to whatever they're planning." Logan sat with that. The particular quality of being known by the wrong people was something he'd lived with before, in a different context, at a different scale, and it had a specific texture. Not quite fear. More like the feeling of standing in a room and realizing the walls are closer than you thought. "I need to ask you something," Patricia said. "Go ahead." "The operation in 2021. What you gave up to keep quiet about it." She met his eyes directly. "If you were willing to talk now, to give testimony that could be verified against what we're finding, it would change things significantly. For the investigation. For your own record." A pause. "I'm not in a position to make promises about what that process would look like, but I know people who could facilitate the right conversations." Logan looked at the window. Outside, a delivery cyclist moved through the intersection against the light, standing on the pedals, going somewhere fast. "Who else knows about this meeting?" he said. "Vanessa. And me." "Not the CFO?" "No." "Not Arthur Fenn?" Patricia didn't look surprised by the name. "No." He looked back at her. "Cole has someone inside the company. It's not a guess. The schedule access, the patch request, the speed of information flow after Harwick. Someone inside is feeding information out." Patricia's expression shifted fractionally. Not surprise, but the particular stillness of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed by an independent source. "We've been developing the same conclusion. You need to find them before they know you're looking." He put his hands flat on the table. "How soon can you move on Cole's connection to the server room incident?" "Legally? With the documentation we have, we could file with the DA's office within a week. But filing starts a clock. Once Cole knows we've filed, he moves whatever he's planning forward." Logan nodded. "Don't file yet." Patricia looked at him steadily. "What are you thinking?" He was thinking about Vanessa in the corridor. Whatever you were before this job, whatever happened. He was thinking about Marcus's drawing on the kitchen wall. "I was thinking about a mission that went wrong in 2021 because someone had decided his life and his team's lives were acceptable costs against a business interest, and about the 14 months he'd spent pushing a cart around buildings trying to be small enough that the same kind of people never found him again." "I'm thinking," Logan said, "that being out of the building might not be the disadvantage they're counting on." Vanessa was in a board meeting when Patricia's text came through. 3 words. He's in. Details later. She read it under the table and put the phone face down and looked at the presentation on the screen at the front of the room, which was about Q4 projections and was being delivered by someone she employed and trusted and was currently unable to process because her mind was in a coffee shop in Long Island City having a conversation she hadn't been part of but that felt, in some way, she couldn't have defended with data, like it mattered more than anything happening in this room. She had not told anyone, not Diane, not Patricia in so many words, not even herself in the clear interior language she normally used to take inventory of her own states, that she'd been thinking about Logan Kane in a way that was not purely professional. It was not a clean or simple thing to acknowledge. Her life had been built around the discipline of keeping things clear, lines of authority, lines between work and home, lines between what she felt and what she acted on. She had learned that discipline in the years after Daniel died, when grief had a way of making everything blurry, and the only way she'd survive that blurriness was by drawing lines everywhere she could see. Logan existed on the wrong side of several of those lines. He was someone she'd employed, someone her company was investigating, someone whose presence in her building had become a complicated tangle of gratitude and security concerns, and whatever it meant that her daughter had asked Mrs. Roach at their last meeting whether the man who helped them was going to be okay. Hailey asked about the people she cared about. She didn't ask about the people she was polite to. Vanessa knew her daughter well enough to understand the distinction. The board meeting ended at 4. She stayed for the debrief, answered 3 questions from the CFO, and was halfway to her office when her phone rang with a number she recognized as one she'd given only to specific people. She answered it in the hallway, turning slightly toward the wall in the way people do when they want the illusion of privacy. "Roach?" she said. "2 things," Patricia said. "First, the inside contact. We've identified them. It's not someone in the executive chain. It's a junior data analyst in the commercial development division, been with the company 8 months. The account activity pattern fits someone who was placed specifically to access project site data." She paused. "He was hired through a staffing firm that also has a connection to Cole's holding structure." Vanessa kept her voice even. "Pull his access tonight, quietly." "Already in process. Second thing." Another pause, and this one had a different quality, more considered. "Kane identified the inside contact as a probability before I'd shared any of the technical evidence with him. He reasoned it from the information flow patterns." She didn't say anything to that. "He also made a tactical point about the timing of the suspension that I think is correct," Patricia continued. "They cleared him out because they're moving soon. The question is what and where." "The gala," Vanessa said. Silence from Patricia's end. "The Kane Ashworth Foundation Gala," Vanessa said, the name coming out of her mouth with the particular clarity of something that had been sitting in the back of her mind and had just found its shape. "It's in 8 days. I'm the keynote. 300 guests, press, the development announcement for the Southbridge site. Half of Cole's business contacts will be in that room because I invited them. If they wanted a moment of maximum exposure with maximum leverage, that's the moment," Patricia said quietly. "Yes." They were both quiet for a second. "I want Kane there," Vanessa said. "He's not on the staff anymore." "Find a way. Consultant, contractor, private guest. Find a way." She paused. "And Patricia, make sure he knows. Not the company asking. Me." Logan received the message that evening through Patricia, relayed the way Patricia relayed things, directly and without decoration. Vanessa Langford was asking him, personally, to be present at the Kane Ashworth Foundation Gala in 8 days. The message included the details of what Patricia and Vanessa believed was being planned, and it ended with a single sentence that Patricia had not edited or added to. "This isn't an assignment. You don't owe us anything, but I'd like you there." He read it twice at the kitchen table while Marcus was in the next room doing homework with the television on low in the background, the 2 sounds mixing into the specific domestic texture of an evening that was ordinary in a way that Logan had spent a long time learning to appreciate without treating as permanent. He thought about saying no. He thought about the prepaid phone, the document box, the exit routes he'd mapped in his head from the Woodside apartment in the first 3 weeks they'd lived there. He thought about 14 months of quiet and what the quiet had cost and what it hadn't actually protected him from. Then he thought about a question asked into a microphone in a ballroom by a 10-year-old girl who had not learned yet to keep the most important things to herself. He texted Marcus's school to flag a possible absence on a date the following week, just in case. Then he called Dana. "I need a favor," he said. "Finally," Dana said immediately, with the energy of someone who had been waiting 18 months to hear those words. "What do you need?" "Can Marcus stay with you for a few days?" A pause. Then, without asking why, "I'll book him a ticket tomorrow." "Dana?" "Logan, stop." Her voice was firm and warm in equal measure. "Just send me his sizes. The kids destroyed his last set of pajamas at Thanksgiving, and I haven't replaced them." He almost laughed at that, which he hadn't expected, and the almost laugh did something to the tightness in his chest that he hadn't been fully aware was there. After he hung up, he sat at the table for a while. Then he went to the closet, moved the blanket, and took out the prepaid phone and the document box. He opened the box, looked at the discharge papers, and put them back. Then he went to the kitchen drawer where he kept a legal pad and wrote out everything he remembered from the 2021 operation. Names, dates, the specific sequence of events that had led to the inquiry, in the dense, precise shorthand of someone who had been trained to record information under conditions where there was no time to be comprehensive. He wrote for 2 hours. The radiator did its thing. The city ran its sounds outside. Marcus came to say goodnight and hugged him around the shoulders the way he'd recently started doing, with the full commitment of a kid who hadn't yet learned to make affection into something smaller than it was. "Night, Dad." "Night, Bud." When Marcus was in his room, Logan looked at the pages he'd written and thought about what they would mean if he gave them to the right people. Not just for the investigation into Cole and the gala, but for everything before. The inquiry, the discharge, the 3 years before that when he had been a person with a career and a rank and colleagues who knew his name in contexts other than maintenance schedules. He thought about Harlan Briggs receiving a $400 million contract while Logan Kane mopped marble floors. He put the pages in the document box, locked it, and replaced it on the shelf. 8 days. The gala was held at the Wentworth Hotel on 57th Street, a different venue than the Meridian Grand, which had been chosen deliberately by the event planning team and which Vanessa had approved without mentioning her reasons. The ballroom on the hotel's 4th floor held 340 people comfortably. The Langford communications team had spent 2 weeks managing the press access list, and Arthur Fenn had aged visibly in the process. Logan arrived at 5:30 p.m., 90 minutes before guests, through the service entrance on the building's north side. He was wearing a dark suit that Patricia's office had arranged. Nothing expensive, nothing that looked arranged, and he'd left his phone with Dana along with his son. He carried the prepaid phone in his inside pocket and nothing else. Patricia met him in the service corridor with 2 members of her team she trusted and had vetted herself. She handed him an earpiece and a building schematic and gave him 7 minutes of briefing that was efficient enough that he found himself, despite everything, professionally satisfied by it. "We've got 4 of Cole's known associates on the guest list," she said. 2 are legitimate business contacts who were invited before we identified the connection. The other 2 were added 3 weeks ago through a request that came through the CFO's office. We cleared the CFO. He was used as a conduit without knowing it. Where's Cole? Not on the guest list, which is either because he's staying clean or because he's not planning to be visible. She paused. We have a car matching a vehicle registered to one of Meridian Tactical's holding entities sitting on the block behind the hotel. How many? The car has been there since 4. We've made 2 passes. At least 2 occupants, possibly 3. Logan looked at the schematic. The ballroom had 2 primary exits, main doors to the north corridor, service doors to the east. 3 stairwells, 1 freight elevator that was currently being used for catering, 2 utility corridors on the 4th floor that connected to the maintenance level above. If they're running the same playbook as Harwick, he said, they'll want the moment of maximum confusion. Lights, noise, crowd. They'll use the service access. We've put 2 people on the freight elevator. They won't come up the freight elevator, too controlled. He looked at the maintenance corridor. Here, above the ballroom. If they can breach the maintenance level, they can come down through the utility access into the east corridor and be inside the room before anyone on the floor knows they're in the building. Patricia looked at the schematic for a moment. Then she got on her radio and moved 2 of her exterior team members to the maintenance level access point without visible hurry. At 6:45, Vanessa arrived. Logan saw her from the far side of the pre-function corridor. She was in a dark green dress that had nothing theatrical about it, the kind of thing a person wears when they care about how they look but aren't performing it, and she was talking to Arthur Fenn with the expression of someone receiving information they didn't fully need but were too polite to cut off. Her daughter was not with her tonight. Hailey was with Diane, which had been Vanessa's decision the moment she and Patricia had mapped out their concerns about the evening. She saw Logan across the corridor at some point between Arthur's second and third sentence. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, just at the edges, and she nodded once, barely perceptible, and he returned it, and then Arthur was pulling her attention back towards something about seating arrangements. Logan turned back to the schematic. The next hour and 15 minutes passed with the particular stretched quality of time before something happens. The air in the corridor carrying the sounds of a filling ballroom, glassware, music, 300 people settling into the social architecture of an event they'd decided to attend for their own various reasons. At 8:07, the earpiece clicked, Patricia's voice controlled and quiet. Movement on the maintenance level, 2 confirmed, possibly 3, finished the sentence. He took the stairs 2 at a time, not running, moving with the specific kind of speed that doesn't announce itself, that looks, if you catch a glimpse of it, like someone who knows where they're going and has a reason to be there. The 4th floor east corridor was empty. He passed the service doors and heard the muffled sound of the ballroom on the other side. The keynote was starting, Vanessa's voice carrying through the wall in the particular cadence of someone who'd given 1,000 speeches and had stopped caring whether she sounded polished. The utility access was at the end of the corridor, a metal door with a push bar, standard commercial construction, the kind of door that looks like it should be louder than it is. Logan stood to the side of it and waited. He heard them before he saw them. Not footsteps exactly, but the quality of weight moving on the other side of the door with the deliberate quiet of people who had been trained to be quiet and were working at it. The push bar moved, the door opened. The first man through was big, moving fast, and did not expect anyone to be standing precisely where Logan was standing. What happened in the utility corridor over the next 90 seconds was not something that the 2 members of Patricia's team, who came up behind Logan 30 seconds in, fully witnessed. They arrived to find Logan standing in the middle of the corridor with a controlled stillness that communicated the situation was resolved, and 3 men in various states of incapacitation on the floor around him, and a 4th who had not made it out of the stairwell. 4, Logan said into the earpiece. Patricia, copy. We've got 2 more in the car downstairs. Local units are moving. From inside the ballroom through the wall, the keynote continued. Vanessa's voice, steady and clear, carrying through concrete and steel to where Logan stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and his breathing already coming back to level, said, "The most important thing we can build isn't a structure. It's the conditions in which people can rely on each other." He stood there for a moment, in the empty corridor with 4 people on the floor and the sound of her voice through the wall. Then Patricia was on the earpiece again, and there were things that needed doing, and he did them. The police were inside the Wentworth by 8:19 p.m. The keynote ended at 8:22, to applause that Vanessa received with the particular collected stillness of someone who had spent the last 40 minutes speaking into a microphone while knowing, through the earpiece Patricia had insisted she wear, despite her objections, that something was happening in the corridor on the other side of the wall behind her. She had not let it show. She had delivered every sentence she'd prepared and 2 she hadn't, and when the applause came she nodded and stepped back from the podium and walked off stage into the wings where Patricia was waiting with the expression of someone who had run a very difficult hour and was still running it. "It's contained," Patricia said immediately, because she knew Vanessa well enough to know that was the first thing she needed to hear. "All 6 are in custody. No guests were aware. The ballroom is secure." Vanessa let out a breath that was quieter than it felt. "Logan?" "East corridor, he's fine." Patricia paused, and there was something in the pause that was almost, not admiration exactly, but the close cousin of it. 4 men in 90 seconds, Vanessa, in a hotel corridor alone before my team got there. Take me to him. The East corridor had the particular aftermath quality of a space where something had happened and been cleaned up just fast enough that the cleaning felt recent. 2 of Patricia's people standing at intervals, a scuff mark on the floor tile that hadn't been there before. The push bar on the utility door slightly out of alignment. Logan was standing near the far wall talking to a plainclothes detective whose body language communicated the specific professional tension of a person recalibrating their assumptions about the situation they'd walked into. He looked up when Vanessa came around the corner. He looked, she noted, tired in a way that was different from his normal economy of expression. Not depleted, but carrying something, the way a person looks after they've done something that cost them more than the physical exertion of it. The detective glanced at her, recognized her, and stepped back half a step in the instinctive deference that Vanessa had spent years neither encouraging nor entirely discouraging because it was occasionally useful. "Ms. Langford," the detective said. "Detective Yara Osi, NYPD. We're going to need a full statement from Mr. Kane when you're done." "You'll have it," Vanessa said. "Give us a minute." The detective withdrew down the corridor with the practiced discretion of someone who had learned that billionaires and their complicated situations were above her pay grade in more ways than one. Vanessa looked at Logan. He looked back at her. The corridor was bright and slightly too cold, the way hotel service areas always were. The air carrying the faint industrial smell of cleaning supplies that had, she was aware, a particular resonance given the context. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No. That's not what your face says." He looked at her for a moment with something that might, on a different person, have been the beginning of a rueful expression. "I'm fine. Couple of bruises that'll show up tomorrow." He paused. "The ballroom, the guests. None of them know anything happened. Arthur is doing the drinks reception with the enthusiasm of a man whose entire professional worth is riding on it, which means he's managing it perfectly." Something in Logan's expression released a fraction. "Good." She crossed her arms in the way she had, not defensive, just the shape she took when she was holding herself steady. "The people downstairs," she said. "Do you know who sent them?" "Cole. Through Meridian Tactical. Patricia has the chain. It goes back 3 links before it gets clean." He looked at the scuff on the floor for a moment. "It also goes back to Briggs. One of the 4 up here was directly involved in the intelligence operation in 2021. I recognized him." Vanessa was very still. "You're sure?" "Yes." She understood what that meant, not just for the investigation, but for Logan, who had just come face to face, in a hotel corridor with a physical embodiment of the thing that had destroyed his career and rerouted his entire life. She didn't say anything about that directly because she didn't think he needed her to, and because she suspected that naming it out loud right now would do something to the composure he was maintaining that he didn't want done to it. "I wrote it down," he said. "What I remember from 2021. All of it." He met her eyes. "Names, dates, operational details I held back from the inquiry. If the right people have it now, with what you and Patricia have built on the Cole side, it's a complete picture." She held his gaze. "That's a significant thing to offer. It's the thing I should have done 3 years ago." He said it without self-pity, just the flat honesty of a person naming a fact they've finished arguing with. "I told myself I was protecting people. Some of that was true. Some of it was that fighting meant being visible, and being visible meant—" He stopped. "It meant people could see what I'd lost. And I wasn't ready for that." The corridor was quiet except for the muffled sounds of the building doing its hotel things. Elevator cables, ventilation, the deep structural hum of a place built to hold people. "I know something about not being ready for that," Vanessa said. He looked at her. Not the way most people looked at her. Not calculating the angle of the comment or managing their response to it. Just looked at her, the way you look at someone who has said something true. "Your husband," he said. 7 years and I'm still moving furniture around in that house trying to fill up the space." She said it lightly, but not dismissively. The lightness of someone who has learned to carry a heavy thing in a way that doesn't stop every conversation. "Hailey asked me the other night whether it was okay to miss someone and want something new at the same time." "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes. That those things can live in the same place." She paused. "I'm still convincing myself I believe it." He nodded, and the nod had the quality of someone who recognized the landscape she was describing from their own interior geography. Down the corridor, Detective Osei was making a call, her voice a low professional murmur that didn't carry. Patricia appeared at the far end and caught Vanessa's eye with an expression that meant, when you're ready, there's a lot to do. Vanessa acknowledged it with a small nod and turned back to Logan. "The document you wrote," she said. "Who do you want to give it to?" Patricia knows a contact at the Inspector General's office, someone who wasn't connected to Briggs's contracts. He paused. If she can set up the right meeting, with someone who can move the inquiry formally, I'll give them everything. I'll make sure it happens. He looked at her for a moment with the level steadiness that she had, she realized, been cataloging for weeks. Not because it was unusual to encounter a person who didn't perform around her, but because she had forgotten what it felt like to be around one long enough to take it for granted. I need to go talk to the detective, he said. I know. He moved to pass her, and she stepped aside, and for a moment they were close enough in the narrow corridor that she could see the exact point at which his tiredness lived. Not in his posture, which was as composed as it always was, but somewhere just behind his eyes, in the particular weight of a person who has spent the better part of a decade not letting anyone close enough to see it. She did not say anything. He walked down the corridor to where Detective Osei was waiting. Vanessa stood where she was for a moment longer, looking at the scuff mark on the floor. Then she went to find Arthur Fenn and the 280 guests who were currently drinking wine and knowing nothing, which was exactly as it should be. Garrison Cole was arrested at his home in Greenwich, Connecticut at 6:15 the following morning. He came to the door in a robe with the specific expression of a man who had been up most of the night waiting for news that hadn't come, which told the detectives who arrested him, before they said a word, that he already knew what it was about. He didn't resist. He stood in the doorway of a house that had cost $4 million and looked at the badge and the warrant and said, with the resigned flatness of someone watching a long-prepared disaster arrive, "I'd like to call my attorney." "Of course," said the detective. He made the call from the back of the vehicle because they allowed him that, and his attorney answered on the second ring with the alert professionalism of a man who billed $400 an hour and was always technically on duty, and Garrison said, "It's collapsed, all of it. Come to the precinct." The attorney arrived at 8 a.m. and was briefed by 8:30 and emerged from the consultation room 45 minutes later with an expression that was very carefully not showing what the consultation had contained. Garrison Cole, it would later become clear, had been significantly more involved in the organization behind both the Harwick operation and the Wentworth attempt than his layers of corporate insulation had been designed to suggest, and the 6 people currently in NYPD custody had, by the time the sun came up, been made to understand that the insulation was not going to protect him sufficiently to be worth their silence. Harlan Briggs was served with a federal subpoena the same morning at the offices of Briggs Consulting Group on K Street in Washington by 2 agents from the Inspector General's office who had been building a parallel case file for 11 months and had been waiting, with the specific patience of people who work in institutions that move slowly, for exactly the kind of additional corroborating documentation that Logan Kane's written account provided. Patricia Roach set up the meeting with the IG contact in a conference room at a law firm in Midtown, neutral ground again, and Logan sat across from a woman named Agent Calloway, small, sharp-eyed, with the manner of someone who had heard a great many stories and developed finely calibrated equipment for distinguishing the ones that were true, and talked for 3.5 hours. He did not hedge. He did not minimize. He told it in the same sequence he'd written it down, with the same dense specificity, and when Calloway asked follow-up questions, he answered them without the particular executive reflex of consulting how the answer would land before giving it. Toward the end, she looked up from her notes and said, "Why didn't you bring this forward 3 years ago?" He considered the question. "I told myself it was about protecting operational security." "And now?" "Now I think that was mostly true and partly a way of not having to fight when I was too tired to fight correctly." He paused. "I have a son. After 2021, I was running on about 30%. I didn't trust myself to fight this the right way, and I was afraid that fighting it wrong would make things worse for people I'd put in the field." He met her eyes. "I still don't know if I made the right call, but I can tell you what happened, and I can let you decide what to do with it." Calloway looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notes and said, "We'll be in touch within the week." Logan walked out of the law firm onto 45th Street at 1:30 in the afternoon, the November air clean and brutally cold, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets. Above him, the city went about its business. Windows and scaffolding and the particular visual noise of Midtown on a weekday that had always felt to him like the built equivalent of people talking all at once. He called Dana. "How's Marcus?" Currently defeating my 14-year-old at a video game, Dana said, and being very gracious about it, which is somehow worse. How are you? I think it's moving, he said. The thing I've been... He stopped. It's moving. A pause from her end that was warm and careful. Logan, that's... She stopped too. They were alike that way, both of them. Their mother's children, raised in a house where the biggest things were said in the smallest words. Good, she said finally. That's good. Tell Marcus I'll call him tonight. He knows. He told me to tell you to not worry, which is his way of saying he's worried. Logan almost smiled. Tell him I'm fine. Tell him yourself tonight. She hung up, which was also their mother's style. He put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the subway, and for the first time in a long time, the walking felt like something other than retreat. The gathering at Vanessa's house 3 weeks later was not what anyone had originally designed it to be. The original purpose, which had been announced quietly through Vanessa's communications team as a small private dinner to introduce close colleagues and friends to the person she'd chosen to step into her personal life, had been conceived before Harwick, before the suspension, before the Wentworth corridor, when the idea of Vanessa Langford publicly choosing someone had still been framed, at least in the media's imagination, as a romantic denouement to the gala story, the billionaire and her mystery janitor, the class contrast fairy tale that practically wrote itself. The reality, as realities tend to be, was more complicated and less tidy, and somehow, because of that, more worth having. Vanessa's home in Riverdale was a house rather than a building, which was how she thought of it to distinguish it from the glass and steel of her professional life. It had a garden that was dormant in December, a kitchen that her late husband Daniel had designed with an architect friend, and that still had a dent in the plaster near the pantry door from the time he'd walked into it carrying too many boxes from a hardware store and hadn't fixed it before he died, and which Vanessa had painted around every time the kitchen was repainted because she couldn't explain to herself why she hadn't just repaired it. The house held 14 people comfortably. Tonight it held 12, which was close enough. Patricia was there with her husband, a quiet man named Robert, who made furniture in his garage on weekends, and had the easy social patience of someone who had married an extrovert and learned to enjoy the periphery. Diane was there, in a red sweater that was slightly louder than everything else in the room, which was consistent with her as a person. Arthur Fenn had been invited and had arrived with a bottle of wine he'd clearly researched, and the air of someone surprised to have been included, which had made Vanessa feel briefly guilty for the amount of grief she gave him professionally. Gerald, Logan's former supervisor, was there because Logan had asked if he could invite him, and Vanessa had said of course, and Gerald had shown up in his good jacket and seemed genuinely delighted and slightly overwhelmed by the entire situation. Dana was there from Raleigh, having arranged the trip with a decisiveness that suggested she'd been looking for the excuse. She was tall and angular in the way of Logan, and had walked into the house and looked at Vanessa and said, without preamble, "He talks about you more than he thinks he does," which was not something Vanessa had known how to respond to, but which had made Diane, standing nearby, press her lips together to contain something. Marcus and Hailey were in the living room. They had met for the first time 4 days earlier, in what Vanessa had privately dreaded as one of those encounters where too much depends on the outcome, and the dependence makes the outcome worse. What had actually happened was that Marcus had arrived with Logan, looked at Hailey with the assessing directness of an 8-year-old, and said, "Do you play Minecraft?" And Hailey had said, "I'm more of a creative mode person," and Marcus had said, "That's fine, creative mode is valid," with the grave tolerance of a child making a significant ideological concession, and they had gone to Hailey's room and been largely self-sufficient for the subsequent 2 hours. Children, Vanessa had reflected afterward, were frequently better at this than adults. Tonight they were on the couch together, watching something on a tablet, Marcus with his feet tucked under him, and Hailey upright in the particular way she always sat when she was doing 2 things at once, watching the screen and listening to the room at the same time, which was a habit she'd inherited from her mother and which Vanessa occasionally felt guilty about. Logan was in the kitchen. He had arrived 40 minutes early, which Vanessa had learned was his version of being on time, and had somehow migrated to the kitchen in the way that certain people do, not taking over, just finding the place in a house where the most useful thing was happening and being useful in it. He was talking to Robert about something, the two of them leaning against the counter with the ease of men who have found an immediate language in common. And when Vanessa came in to check on the bread she'd left warming, Logan looked up and said, "Robert knows someone who can fix the dent in the pantry door," without any preamble that indicated he'd noticed it, registered it, and understood something about why it was still there. Vanessa looked at him. "If you want it fixed," he added, with the careful qualifier of someone who has learned that assumptions about what people want repaired are not always accurate. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. He nodded, the way he nodded at things that required no argument, and turned back to Robert. She stood there for a second longer than she needed to, holding the bread pan, looking at the kitchen that her husband had designed with his architect friend and that she had lived in for 7 years, with the dent in the wall and the particular sound of the refrigerator and the window that looked out into the dormant garden, and thought about the way that spaces hold the people who've been in them, and the way that new people in a space change, not what it holds, but what you can see of what it holds. She put the bread on the counter and went back to her guests. The dinner itself was loud in the specific way that good dinners are loud. Multiple conversations happening simultaneously, the occasional burst of laughter from one end of the table that made the other end turn to ask what they'd missed, the territorial negotiations over the last of the roasted vegetables that were conducted with the elaborate politeness of people who had eaten enough together to feel comfortable being impolite about food. Dana told a story about Logan at 17 that he had clearly not anticipated, and that produced the specific expression of a person who has decided that protesting will only extend the story. It involved a lawnmower, a neighbor's fence, and a level of denial that Dana described as, and this is a direct quote, historic. Marcus listened with the riveted attention of a child encountering parental mythology, and Hailey said, "Your dad made mistakes?" with genuine surprise, which Logan received with a look that was trying very hard not to be the most human expression anyone in the room had seen on his face. "Frequently," he said. Hailey seemed to find this deeply satisfying. Diane told a different kind of story, about Vanessa, 23 years old, standing in Diane's kitchen at 2 in the morning eating cereal because she couldn't afford the gas to drive home after working a double shift, and was too stubborn to say so until Diane had simply handed her the keys to the couch. Vanessa received this with the tolerant composure of someone who has made peace with being known, and Arthur Fenn looked at her across the table with the expression of a man gently revising a professional narrative he'd been working with for years. Gerald, who had been quiet for most of the dinner, in the way of a man processing a situation he was grateful to be included in but still assembling, said at one point, "I have to say, and I mean this, I always thought Logan was good people. I just thought he was very private good people." He paused. "Now I'm sitting in this house, and I feel like I didn't know the half of it." "You didn't," Dana said cheerfully. "Nobody did," Logan said, and it came out slightly drier than he'd probably intended, which made Dana laugh and Gerald nod with the philosophical acceptance of a man who has been a supervisor long enough to know that his direct reports contain multitudes he will never access. After dinner, the gathering arranged itself the way gatherings do. A smaller cluster in the living room, a couple of people standing in the kitchen with wine, the children absorbed in whatever collaborative project they'd constructed on the tablet. Vanessa found herself standing near the window with Patricia, who had a cup of coffee and the expression of someone who had been watching the room with professional attention and had arrived at conclusions that she was considering how much to share. "You should know," Patricia said, keeping her voice in the range of the two of them. "The IG contacted me this morning. The inquiry into Briggs has been formally reopened. Kane's testimony plus the Meridian documentation plus the thread we built from the Wentworth incident. It's enough to move on." She paused. "The DoD has also initiated a review of Kane's discharge classification. I was told, informally, not for attribution, that the review is a formality." Vanessa looked out the window at the garden. The dormant beds, the bare tree at the far corner, the light from the house spilling out into the cold in a yellow rectangle. "He doesn't know yet. I thought you might want to tell him." She stayed with that for a moment. "Tonight?" Patricia looked across the room to where Logan was talking to Dana and Marcus simultaneously, his hand on the back of Marcus's chair in the absent-minded way of a parent who tracks where their kid is without meaning to make a show of it. "That's your call," she said. "But I'll say this. In my experience, People who have been carrying a thing for a long time sometimes need to hear that they can put it down while they're somewhere they feel safe enough to let themselves react. Vanessa looked at her. When did you become a therapist? I've been doing security for 22 years, Patricia said. You pick things up. She left Vanessa at the window and went to find her husband. Vanessa waited until the room had shifted, until Dana had taken Marcus to call the kids back in Raleigh, until Hailey was showing Diane something on her tablet, until the conversation density dropped enough that she could cross to where Logan was standing with Gerald at the edge of the kitchen, the two of them holding coffee cups in the companionable silence of men who had run out of things they needed to say and had arrived at the comfortable territory on the other side. Gerald took one look at Vanessa and said, with the instinct of a man who had navigated many such moments, I'm going to go check on the dessert situation, and moved away with the dignified efficiency of someone conducting a tactical withdrawal. Logan looked at her. She leaned against the counter beside him, not facing him, both of them looking out into the living room, which was a slightly easier configuration for what she needed to say. Patricia got word from the IG today. They've reopened the Briggs inquiry. He was quiet. And the DOD is reviewing your discharge. She said the review is a formality. She paused. That means what I think it means. He was still quiet. She glanced at him sidelong and found him looking at the middle distance with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the level steadiness, not the careful composure, but something underneath those things, in the place where they'd come from. He looked like a person who had been standing very straight for a very long time and had just felt the ground under them change character. You okay? She said. He breathed out slowly. I'll get there. That's not the same as okay. No, he agreed. It's not. They stood there for a moment, and from the living room came the sound of Hailey and Marcus arguing pleasantly about something on the tablet, and Dana laughing at a story Robert was telling, and Diane asking Arthur something about the company that Arthur was clearly thrilled to be asked. My daughter likes your son, Vanessa said. My son likes your daughter. He told me she has good taste in games, which is a significant endorsement. She told me he was pretty reasonable for a boy. High bar. From Hailey, extremely high. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd been cataloging since the laundromat story, the one that lived at the corner of his mouth and required more than professional effort to produce. She'd come to think of it as a kind of indicator, the way a gauge tells you something about what's running underneath. Logan. She turned to look at him directly, and he turned to look at her, and the kitchen was warm and slightly too bright and smelled like roasted garlic and bread and the coffee they were both holding. The last few weeks have been... She stopped, tried again. I'm not good at this part. I run a company with 900 employees and I can give a 40-minute keynote without notes, but I am historically terrible at saying the obvious thing when it needs to be said. He waited. He was very good at waiting. I'm glad you were in my building, she said. I'm glad you were there on the 5th floor at Harwick. I'm glad you were in that corridor at the Wentworth. She paused. And I'm glad you're here tonight. Not because of any of those other things, just here. The kitchen was quiet. From the living room, the sound of people who were, at this specific moment, comfortable in the same space together. I'm glad too, he said. And it had the texture of a person who had said few enough of those words in the past several years that they still meant something specific when they came out. It was not a resolution. It was not a clean ending or a tidy beginning. It was two people in a kitchen, each of them carrying the particular architecture of what their lives had made them, each of them aware that what was in front of them would be more difficult and more ordinary and more worth it than anything the previous weeks had contained. Hailey appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the two of them with the specific assessment of a 10-year-old who has been quietly tracking a situation for longer than the adults involved have been aware. Can we have dessert? She said. Ask your grandmother, Vanessa said, which was what she called Diane when Diane was in the house, a habit they'd both long since stopped explaining. Hailey looked at Logan. Marcus says you make really good brownies. Logan looked at her. Sometimes. Could you make them next time? He seemed to turn this over briefly, with the seriousness that a person applies when a child is asking something that has more layers to it than the surface question. Yeah, he said, I could do that. Hailey nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back into the living room in the decisive way of someone who has gathered all the information she needed and is done with the meeting. Vanessa looked at Logan. Logan looked at the doorway where Hailey had been. She doesn't ask everyone to make brownies, Vanessa said. I figured, he said. Outside, the garden was dark and cold and December dormant, the bare tree doing what bare trees do in winter, holding its shape, waiting, doing the unseen work of being something that would, when the season changed, be ready. The formal clearing of Logan Kane's military record was processed 43 days later, on a Tuesday morning, in a document that arrived as a certified letter to his apartment in Woodside, and that he opened at the kitchen table before Marcus was awake. It was 12 pages of official language surrounding a single, irreducible fact. The inquiry of 2021 had been reviewed and found to have been initiated on the basis of fabricated intelligence, and the administrative separation of Major Logan Kane had been effected in error. His record would be corrected. His rank, his commendations, and his service classification were restored. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and sat at the table in the early morning quiet of the apartment. The radiator, the street sounds beginning below, the smell of the building waking up, and looked at Marcus's drawing on the wall. Dad and me. He sat with it for a long time. When Marcus came out in his pajamas, hair going in several directions, looking for cereal with the focused single-mindedness of a person who has not yet fully entered consciousness, Logan said, "Come here a second, bud." Marcus turned from the cabinet, looked at his father, came to the table without asking why, the way he'd learned to read the difference between the kinds of things his father needed to say. Logan put his hand on the back of the boy's head, the way he had that night at the dinner table, the absent-minded gesture that wasn't actually absent-minded at all. "Everything okay?" Marcus said. "Yeah," Logan said. "Everything's okay." Marcus studied him with the particular forensic attention of a child who has learned to take his father's okay as a starting point rather than a conclusion. Then he seemed to accept it, or to decide that what he saw in his father's face that morning was something he recognized as true, and he went to get his cereal, and Logan sat at the table with the envelope in his hands and the sounds of an ordinary morning filling the apartment. Later that morning, he called Vanessa. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear in the background the compressed sound of her office. Keyboards, a distant conversation, the particular ambient frequency of a floor where things were always in motion. "I got a letter this morning," he said. A pause on her end. Then quietly, "Tell me." He told her. And while he talked, he heard the background sounds diminish, a door closing, probably. And then there was just her voice on the line and his, and the clear December morning outside the window of the Woodside apartment where a man who had spent 3 years trying to be invisible finally understood that the thing he'd been afraid of, being seen, was not the thing he'd needed to fear. What he'd needed to fear was the habit of making himself small enough that the people who might have seen him never got the chance. He was done with that now. The call that morning, Logan's voice on the line, measured and quiet the way it always was, telling her about the letter, did something to Vanessa that she hadn't fully anticipated. She'd known it was coming. Patricia had told her the timeline, and Vanessa had tracked it the way she tracked things that mattered, checking in with her IG contact twice a week with the particular disciplined restraint of a person who wants very badly to push and has decided not to. She'd known it was coming, and she'd thought she was prepared for it. She wasn't prepared for the sound of his voice telling her. She closed her office door and sat on the edge of her desk and listened to him read sections of the letter. In the flat, careful way of someone reading something official. "They're still deciding is real." And she thought about a man who had carried the weight of a false record for 3 years while mopping marble floors in buildings full of people who never looked at him. And she had to breathe through something in her chest that didn't have a clean name, but that she recognized as the specific ache of arriving at a good thing too late to have spared someone the cost of getting there. "Logan," she said when he'd finished. "Yeah. How do you feel?" A pause. The kind he took when he was being honest rather than functional. "Like I've been holding my breath for 3 years and I'm not sure I know how to breathe out yet." She didn't try to fix that with words because it didn't need fixing. "Take the day," she said. "Whatever you need. I've got Marcus." "I know. Take the day anyway." He did. And she went back to her desk and her calendar and her 900 employees and the afternoon's board prep materials, and she worked with the focused efficiency that had always been her primary coping mechanism, and she was 3 pages into the Q1 projections when she put the projections down and looked at the window and understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives uninvited in the middle of ordinary work, that she was happy. Not the managed contentment of a life running correctly. Actually happy, in the inconvenient, slightly frightening way that involves other people and therefore involves risk and cannot be optimized or insured against or controlled through any mechanism available to someone who runs a billion-dollar company. She'd forgotten what that felt like. She let herself feel it for approximately 4 minutes. Then she picked up the projections. Harlan Briggs was indicted on 7 counts in late January in a federal courthouse in Washington where the hallways smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee and the weight of a great many decisions that had been made there over many years. The indictment covered fraud, obstruction, falsification of federal contract records, and conspiracy to commit the same, charges that had been building since the IG's formal reopening of the inquiry, and that had accumulated in the months since Logan's testimony, with the slow inevitability of something that has always been structurally true and has simply been waiting for the right pressure to make it visible. Garrison Cole was charged separately in New York on counts related to the Harwick and Wentworth operations, the corporate espionage against Langford Global, and a series of financial crimes that Patricia's forensic accounting contacts had been unwinding since November. His attorney released a statement describing his client as the victim of a business conspiracy, which was the kind of statement that convinces no one and exists primarily to give the person who issued it somewhere to put their energy. Logan was not present at either proceeding. He had given his testimony, signed his documents, answered the follow-up questions from Calloway's office with the same unflinching specificity he'd brought to the original meeting. And then he had gone back to Queens and picked up Marcus from school and made dinner and helped with homework and done all the ordinary things that the previous 3 years had been practiced for, except now they felt different, not lighter exactly, but less burdened with the specific weight of a thing left unfinished. Patricia sent him a text the morning of the Briggs indictment that said, "It's done." 2 words, which was the right number. He texted back, "Thank you." Also 2 words. He showed Marcus the news report that evening, a carefully edited version, the parts that explained what had happened without requiring explanation of everything that had come before it. Marcus listened with the focused attention he brought to things he understood were important, and then said, "So the bad guy is in trouble now?" "The bad guy is in a lot of trouble now. Because you told the truth about what he did. Because a lot of people did. I was one of them." Marcus seemed to think about this with the particular thoroughness of a kid who is building a picture rather than just receiving information. "Dad, were you scared when you told the truth?" It was the same question he'd asked after Harwick, in slightly different form. Logan had learned, over the months since, that Marcus asked about fear not because he was worried, but because he was trying to understand the relationship between being scared and doing something anyway, which was a thing he was working out for himself at 8 years old in the specific context of a boy who had a father who never seemed afraid and was slowly realizing that this could not be completely true. "Yes," Logan said, "a different kind of scared than the building, but yes." "What were you scared of?" "That it wouldn't matter, that I'd put everything out there and it wouldn't change anything and I'd have given up the quiet for nothing." He paused. "That kind of scared is harder than the other kind, I think. Because there's nothing to do with it except wait." Marcus absorbed this. He had his mother's eyes, dark and direct and taking things in, and his father's habit of going quiet around information that mattered. "But it did matter," he said. "It did. So it was worth being scared." Logan looked at his son across the kitchen table, the homework spread between them, the rice on the stove, the radiator performing its nightly grievance, and thought about all the things he wanted to say and all the ways that saying them wrong would diminish them. "Yeah," he said, "it was worth it." Marcus nodded with the satisfied gravity of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. Then he went back to his math worksheet, and Logan went to stir the rice, and the evening continued the way evenings do, in the small, unremarkable increments that make up most of a life, and that only become visible as significant when you've spent time living a version of them that felt like waiting for the real thing to start. The public reaction to the full story, which emerged in pieces across January and February as the legal proceedings generated disclosure and the disclosure generated coverage, was not simple, because nothing that involves real people and real institutions ever is. The early wave was what Arthur Fenn had predicted and dreaded, a media appetite for the romantic geometry of it. Janitor who saved Billionaire twice vindicated as decorated war hero. That was the cleanest version. There were less clean versions that were more interested in Vanessa's personal life than in Logan's record, and versions that focused on Harlan Briggs with the breathless energy of people who enjoy watching powerful men fall, and versions that managed to make the whole thing about the real estate market implications of the Southbridge development site, which was impressive in its own way. Vanessa's communications team managed the coverage with the exhausted professionalism of people who had been managing things since October and were running on institutional momentum. Arthur Fenn aged another perceptible amount. Logan did not give interviews, which was his right, and which the more aggressive outlets treated as a story in itself until newer stories arrived to displace it. What actually happened, underneath the coverage in the texture of the days, was less dramatic and more durable. Logan accepted a position with Langford Global in early February, Director of Security and Emergency Preparedness, a role that Patricia had spent 3 weeks designing in consultation with him to ensure it was a real job and not a gesture. He started on a Monday, which was deliberately ordinary. He moved through the building on his first day with the ease of someone who had already mapped every corridor and utility access and stairwell configuration, which he had, in a different context, and which gave the work an immediate practical foundation. His team was small and carefully selected and treated him, after the first week, with the specific professional respect of people who have worked with someone and decided they've earned it rather than just been assigned it. He did not move to a different apartment immediately. Marcus had friends at PS 153 and had been through enough transition for 1 year, and the Radiator's nightly performance had become, in its way, a form of familiarity. They stayed in Woodside through the spring and into the summer, and Vanessa drove out on Thursdays for dinner when her schedule allowed, which it did more often as the weeks went on because she started treating Thursday evenings as a non-negotiable in the way she'd previously only treated board meetings. Mrs. Okafor, who charged $20 an evening and sent children home with containers of jollof rice, had formed an opinion about these developments that she shared with Logan one morning in the hallway outside their apartment doors. "That woman looks at you like she's trying to figure out what she did to deserve you." She paused. "I think that's a good sign." "I appreciate the input," Logan said. "I'm going to keep providing it," she said pleasantly, and went back inside. The Cain Langford Foundation was Hailey's idea. Not the name, that came later, but the idea itself. She had been sitting at the kitchen table in Vanessa's house in Riverdale one Saturday in March, doing homework. While the adults talked in the way that adults talk when they think children are absorbed in other things, which is to say loudly enough that a child paying attention could follow most of it. The conversation was about the money. The civil suit Langford Global had filed against Garrison Cole and his holding entities had produced a settlement, substantial, and structured in a way that involved a significant fund designated for charitable use, which Vanessa's legal team had insisted on, and Cole's team had accepted because the alternative was a courtroom. Vanessa and Logan were discussing, with the circular, inconclusive energy of two people who agree on the destination but haven't agreed on the route, what the fund should be used for. Hailey looked up from her homework. "Veterans?" she said. They both looked at her. "And people who get in trouble for things they didn't do," she continued, with the clarity of someone who has been thinking about this for longer than the current conversation. "And parents who are doing it by themselves." She looked at Logan. "Like you were." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," Logan said after a beat. "Those would be the right people." Vanessa looked at her daughter. This child who had stood at a microphone 6 months earlier and asked a question that had felt, in the moment, like an embarrassment to be managed, and that had turned out to be the most clarifying thing said in that ballroom all year. Where did that come from? Hailey shrugged with the particular studied casualness of a 10-year-old who doesn't want to be seen being earnest. "You and Logan both had hard things happen that weren't fair. You fixed yours because you had money and people who could help. Some people don't have that." She went back to her homework. "So maybe the foundation helps them have that." Vanessa looked at Logan. Logan looked at Vanessa. There was nothing to say to that improved on it. The foundation was formally established in April, structured around 3 pillars that Hailey had identified at the kitchen table. career and legal support for veterans navigating wrongful discharge or service-related legal complications, emergency financial assistance and counseling for single parents in crisis, and a scholarship program for children of wounded or fallen service members. The name was a compromise between Logan's preference for something that didn't have his name in it and Vanessa's position that it should, because the story of how it came to exist was part of its purpose. They launched with a press event that Logan found excruciating, and Vanessa managed with the fluency of someone who has been managing public attention for 15 years, and that Hailey attended in a blue dress. A different blue than the one from the October gala, though the color was close enough that Diane noticed and said nothing, because some things are for the people in them. In the first 8 months, the foundation received 412 applications. It could initially fund 63. Vanessa personally called 3 additional donors before the 3rd month was out, which was not in the operational plan, but was consistent with her as a person. They got married in September. Not the September immediately following all of this, the one after, which gave them a year that was not dramatic. A year of dinners and school pickups and Hailey's school play, in which Marcus, who attended at Logan's invitation and sat between Logan and Vanessa in the 3rd row, whispered commentary throughout with the confidence of a person who had strong artistic opinions and a neighbor willing to listen. A year of Logan learning the geography of Vanessa's grief, not mapping it, not trying to fix the coordinates of it, but understanding where it lived and how to be present in the same room with it without making it a project. A year of Vanessa learning that Logan's version of emotional expression was not absence but compression, that when he went quiet, something was happening in the quiet that was worth waiting for, and that the waiting was not the same as being left. There were hard months in that year. There was a night in February when Vanessa came home from a board meeting that had gone wrong in a specific way that made her feel like everything she'd built was more precarious than she'd admitted, and she sat on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, just because the kitchen floor was where she ended up. And Logan sat down on the floor next to her and didn't say anything for a while, and then said, "What do you need right now?" And she said, "I don't know." And he said, "Okay," and stayed on the floor. That was the moment she understood that she was going to marry him. Not because he had saved her life twice, not because he was exceptional in the ways that the newspapers had described when they'd run out of ways to describe the more obvious things, but because he had sat on a kitchen floor at 10:30 p.m. and asked what she needed and accepted. "I don't know" as a complete answer and stayed anyway. There was a night in May when Logan woke up at 2 a.m. from a dream he didn't describe and sat at the kitchen table in the Woodside apartment with a glass of water and his hands flat on the table. And Marcus appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, the 2 small ones that Logan kept forgetting to replace, and looked at his father for a moment and then went to get his own glass of water and sat across the table. And they sat there together in the dark kitchen without talking, and eventually Marcus said, "You know you can tell me stuff, right? I'm almost 9. And Logan looked at his son and said, "I know." "You don't have to tell me everything," Marcus said. "Just so you know you have stuff." Logan sat with that. "Yeah," he said, "I have stuff." "Okay," Marcus said. He drank his water. "You're still the best dad I know." "I'm the only dad you know." "That's not true. I know Tyler's dad." "Fair." "You're still better." Logan looked at his son across the kitchen table at 2 a.m. in their apartment in Woodside, the city quietly running outside, the radiator cooling down from its evening performance, the bare bulb above them throwing the particular yellow light of a room that has been lived in by people who are not interested in ambience. "Go back to bed, bud." "Going," Marcus said, and took his water glass and went. The wedding was at a lakeside property in Connecticut that belonged to a friend of Vanessa's from her 20s, a woman named Carol, who had inherited the place from her grandmother and maintained it with the pragmatic affection of someone who understands that old things require effort, but are worth it. The house sat back from the water behind a sloping lawn, and the ceremony was on the dock, which was structurally sound, but looked like it had opinions about being asked to hold 12 people, and which held 12 people without complaint. 12 people. Not a guest list, a group. Diane was there in something burgundy that she'd clearly put thought into. Patricia and Robert, Dana and her husband, and their teenagers, who were at the age where they alternated between genuine warmth and performed indifference, and landed, for this occasion, on warmth. Gerald, who had driven from New Jersey and arrived early, and stood at the edge of the dock with a look of satisfaction that was the most uncomplicated expression Vanessa had seen on anyone all day. Arthur Fenn, who had been invited late and almost hadn't come and then had, and who stood in the back with the particular stillness of a man who is privately moved by something and has decided to be a professional about it. And Hailey and Marcus, who stood beside their parents during the ceremony with the focused seriousness of children who have been told this is important and have decided to take the instruction at full value. Hailey held Vanessa's hand. Marcus stood next to Logan with his hands in his pockets and his good shoes on, the ones he'd complained about in the car because they pinched, and that he was wearing without complaint because some things were worth the pinch. The person conducting the ceremony was a friend of Carol's, a retired family court judge named Harriet, who had the practical warmth of someone who had seen many versions of people trying to build things together and had developed genuine, unsentimental appreciation for the attempt. She didn't give a speech. She asked them to say what they wanted to say to each other, and they did, and what they said was not what either of them had planned to say, but was, because of that, more true. Vanessa went first. She looked at Logan across the dock with the September light on the water behind him and said, "I spent a long time building things that were meant to prove something. I'm done proving things. I just want to build something that's real." She paused. "You're the most real person I've met in a very long time, and I want—" She stopped. Started again, slightly off script from whatever she'd rehearsed. "I want to be the kind of person who deserves to stand next to you. I'm going to keep working on that." Logan was quiet for a moment. He was not, she knew, someone for whom public declaration was natural. It cost him something, and the cost was visible in the way he held himself, slightly more deliberate than usual, the composure doing more work than it normally needed to do. "I didn't think I was going to get here," he said. "Not this specifically, just somewhere I was allowed to take up space again." He looked at her. "You didn't offer me that. You just acted like it was already true. And after a while I started believing it." He paused. "I'm going to try to do the same thing for you, every day, because you've been doing it for longer than you think." Harriet said the things a judge says, and they said the things people say in those moments, and then it was done. Hailey, still holding her mother's hand, looked up at Logan with the direct assessment she'd been directing at him since the first time they'd properly met, and said, "Are you staying?" Logan crouched down so they were at the same level. It was what Vanessa had done on the stage at the gala 10 months earlier, and the echo of it moved through the dock and the 12 people on it in a way that most of them felt without naming. "Yes," he said. Hailey looked at him for another moment, the specific forensic look of a child who has learned to verify rather than assume. Then she nodded with the gravity of someone concluding a long-running inquiry. "Okay," she said. Marcus, who had been standing slightly to the side with his hands still in his pockets and the pinching shoes on, said, "Does this mean we're moving to the house in Riverdale?" "We're going to figure that out," Vanessa said. "Because my school is in Woodside," Marcus said. "I know where your school is, Marcus." "I'm just saying." "We know," Logan said. "We'll figure it out." Marcus seemed to find this acceptable, which was the most that could be asked from a 9-year-old being told that a significant variable in his life was to be determined. He went to get a piece of the cake that Carol had set out on a folding table near the dock's edge, and Hailey followed him, and the adults did what adults do when the formal part is over and the real part begins. They arranged themselves in the late September afternoon and talked and ate and watched the lake do its lake things. And the light came off the water in the specific way it does in Connecticut, in fall, golden and slightly melancholy and very beautiful, and nobody tried to make it into more than what it was. There is a particular lie that stories about exceptional people tend to tell, and it goes something like this, that what made them exceptional was the dramatic thing, the rescue, the sacrifice, the moment where they did what others couldn't or wouldn't. The story gets built around that moment, and the moment becomes the person, and the person becomes a symbol, and somewhere in that process, the actual human being, complicated, inconsistent, doing their best with what they have on days that contain no drama whatsoever, gets flattened into something that serves the story more than the truth. Logan Kane was not a symbol. He was a man who had been good at something dangerous and had lost the career it gave him through no fault of his character, and who had then spent 3 years being quietly good at something undramatic while raising his son and paying his rent and eating leftover rice cold at a kitchen counter because he was tired and couldn't be bothered to heat it. He was a man who had walked into two dangerous situations in the same month because there were people in them who needed help, and he was standing there and knew how, and who had gone back to work afterward because the work still needed doing. He was a man who sat on kitchen floors and waited out 2 a.m. bad dreams at tables with an 8-year-old who wore pinching shoes to a wedding without complaint. These things are not less than the dramatic thing. They are, in every way that accumulates into a life, more. Vanessa was not a symbol either. She was a woman who had built something remarkable out of genuine determination and had also used that same determination, for years, to avoid feeling the full weight of what she'd lost. She had drawn lines everywhere she could see and called it discipline and been half right about that. She was a woman who sat on kitchen floors at 10:30 p.m. and didn't always know what she needed and had finally found someone willing to stay while she figured it out. She was a mother who had stood in a ballroom and let her daughter's question unmake a carefully constructed public image, and who had been better for it, and who still sometimes needed 4 minutes alone with a window view before she could remember that happiness was allowed. Hailey, who had asked the question that started all of it, was 11 now, and had not lost the directness that had put her at a microphone in October. If anything, a year of watching her mother move towards something real had given her a more specific language for what she'd been asking for, which was not a father figure or a family structure or any of the things the coverage had reduced her question to. What she'd been asking for was simpler and harder than any of that. She'd been asking whether the people she loved were going to be okay, whether okay was possible, whether the things that had been lost could make room for something that wasn't a replacement but was its own true thing. The answer had turned out to be yes, but not in the way anyone had planned, and through a route that nobody would have predicted, and at a cost that was real and couldn't be retroactively eliminated by the good outcome. That's how most true answers arrive. Marcus grew 3 inches between October and the following September, and took a sudden intense interest in cooking that Logan traced back to a Saturday afternoon at the Riverdale house, when Vanessa's friend Diane had let him help make soup from scratch, and hadn't treated him like a child who needed supervision so much as a person who needed instruction. He made soup for Logan the following Sunday, chicken and rice, slightly oversalted, genuinely good, and Logan ate the whole bowl and asked for the recipe, which Marcus provided from memory with the pride of someone who has learned that making something good for someone else is one of the more reliable routes to feeling like yourself. The foundation, by its second year, had assisted 219 people across its 3 pillars. Logan hired a director of programs, a woman named Sylvia, who had come from veterans advocacy work, and who ran the operation with the specific combination of efficiency and real human investment that is rare and therefore worth paying for. Vanessa chaired the board. They were in the foundation office together approximately twice a month, and the staff, who were not unobservant, had formed opinions about the dynamic between the chair and the director of security and emergency preparedness. And these opinions were never stated directly because the staff were professional, but were clearly visible in the particular kind of polite neutrality people deploy when they are studiously not noticing something. Gerald came to the Foundation's first annual reception and stood in the corner with a glass of sparkling water and looked at Logan in a director's name badge talking to a state senator about veteran employment programs, and then looked at the floor that had been recently cleaned by someone who was not Logan Kane and would never be as good at it, and had the expression of a man experiencing several emotions simultaneously that he didn't have the vocabulary for but felt deeply. He found Vanessa near the end of the evening. "I just want to say," he started and stopped, because the sentence had more in it than he'd prepared for. Vanessa waited. "He's good people," Gerald said finally. "I always knew he was good people. He stopped again. "I'm glad somebody else knows it now." "Lots of people know it now," Vanessa said. "Yeah, but..." He looked across the room to where Logan was still talking to the senator, Marcus beside him in a good jacket, listening with the focused attention of a child who is going to remember this conversation. "There's a difference between the public knowing it and the right people knowing it. You know what I mean?" She did know what he meant. She looked at Logan across the room, at the way he stood, the way he listened, the way his hand moved to Marcus's shoulder without interruption to the conversation, the casual habit of it, the ease. And she thought about an October evening in a ballroom when this man had been anonymous in a basement and she had been performing herself on a stage, and neither of them had been fully who they were, or maybe they had been, And what had changed was only that they'd found each other in the space between the performance and the real thing. She thought about all the ways it could have not happened. The versions of November in which Logan had walked out of the building and simply disappeared, gone somewhere quieter, made himself smaller, let the suspension stand, and moved on. The versions in which Vanessa had processed the Harwick incident as a security matter and moved forward with one of the 11 men who were already positioned and legible and available. The extremely plausible version of events in which a woman with a company to run and a grief to manage and a very good set of reasons to keep her lines where they were had simply kept her lines where they were. The gap between what happened and what might have was thin and contingent and had nothing romantic about it. It was just the ordinary precariousness of lives moving alongside other lives, the near-miss quality of all real connections, the fact that people find each other not because the universe arranged it, but because they were in the same corridor at the same moment, and one of them didn't look away. She was glad they hadn't looked away. Gerald went to find more sparkling water, and Vanessa crossed the room, and Logan saw her coming and shifted slightly to make space beside him without breaking the conversation. The way you do with someone whose presence you've learned to expect, which is not a small thing. To be expected, to be made room for, to arrive in a space and find that space already adjusted. She stood beside him. Marcus leaned slightly against her arm, which he did sometimes now, in the comfortable, unconscious way of a kid who has decided you're part of the furniture of his life in the best possible sense. The senator was asking about the Foundation's expansion plans. Logan answered. Vanessa listened. The room held its reception noise around them. Glasses, conversations, the particular warmth of a gathered group of people who have come, because something real is happening, and they want to be near it. Outside, the city ran its evening shift, taxis and buses, and the anonymous industry of several million people going about their lives in the vast collective project of being alive in a place that asks a great deal of you and gives back, if you stay long enough and pay attention, more than you came looking for. Neither Logan Kane nor Vanessa Langford had found each other because they were looking. That was the part that mattered most. Not the drama of it, not the rescue, or the revelation, or the legal vindication, but the accident of it. The fact that being present, being awake to the actual life in front of you, rather than the idea of the life you thought you should be building, turns out to be the only real strategy. Everything else is just what happens on the way. Marcus, 11 months into wearing the pinching shoes to occasions that called for them, leaned over and said quietly to Vanessa, "Can we get food after this? I'm starving." "Yes," she said. "We can get food after this." "Can Logan pick? He always picks the good places." Logan, who had heard this, looked at his son with the expression that lived at the corner of his mouth. "I'll pick," he said. "Good," Marcus said, satisfied, and went back to listening to the senator. And that was that. The story continued the way stories do when they've resolved into lives, not with conclusions, but with the next ordinary thing, and the one after that, and the accumulation of those things into something that doesn't have a name more dramatic than, this is who we are now, and it's enough, and some days it's more than enough, and on the days when it isn't, we stay anyway. That, in the end, was the whole of it.